At dawn, the doors slammed shut. Not on a prison, not on a camp, but on a train. Inside were children clutching their mothers, old men gasping for air, women pressed so tightly together they couldn't sit, couldn't lie down, couldn't even fall when they died. Outside, the engine hissed, the timetable was checked, the whistle blew, and Europe's railways began to move human beings the same way they moved coal, cattle, and steel. No one told the passengers where they were going. The tickets said resettlement. The guard said work. The paperwork said transport. But the destination was death, and the journey itself was already killing them. This is not the story of gas chambers or camps alone. This is the story of how genocide ran on rails, how an entire continent watched trains leave its cities full and return empty, again and again, until millions vanished between departure and arrival, and the world learned too late that the Holocaust did not begin with murder, but with a scheduled departure time. Chapter 1. Before the tracks ran red, Germany's rail empire. The train was already moving before anyone understood what that movement meant. Steel wheels shrieked against steel rails, a sound that cut through the morning air like a blade. Steam rolled along the platform, thick and hot, carrying the smell of oil, coal smoke, and damp iron. To the men in uniform, it was the sound of efficiency. To the clerks holding clipboards, it was the sound of order. To the people watching from behind windows and fences, it was just another departure. No one yet called a weapon, but it was already one. Long before the first deportation train carried families toward ghettos and camps, Germany had built something extraordinary. A web of steel stretching across cities, forests, borders, and mountains. Tracks laid with mathematical precision. Timetables refined to the minute. Switchyards humming day and night with coordination that bordered on obsession. This was not chaos. This was a system engineered to move millions, and to do so with ruthless reliability. By the early 20th century, Germany possessed one of the most advanced railway networks on Earth. Trains bound the nation together tighter than laws or flags ever could. From the industrial heartlands of the Ruhr to the ports of Hamburg, from the farms of Bavaria to the capital in Berlin, the rails carried coal, food, soldiers, and ambition. To ride a German train was to feel the pulse of a modern state. Punctual, disciplined, unforgiving to delay. Railway stations became temples of order. Platforms scrubbed clean. Signals blinking in perfect sequence. Conductors trained not just to transport passengers, but to enforce rules. Silence, compliance, obedience. A misconnection was a personal failure. A late arrival, an embarrassment. The culture of efficiency seeped into everything, shaping how Germans thought about time, labor, and control. Nothing moved without permission. Nothing stopped without cause. When the First World War erupted, the railways proved their true strategic value. Millions of soldiers were mobilized in days, not weeks. Entire armies flowed along the tracks like blood through arteries, delivering men and machines to the front with astonishing speed. Victory and defeat hinged not only on generals and tactics, but on locomotives and schedules. Germany learned a lesson the rest of Europe would never forget. Modern war was won by logistics. Defeat in that war did not weaken the railways. It refined them. In the years that followed, Germany rebuilt its rail system with even greater focus on centralization and control. The network was unified under one state authority, later known as the Deutsche Reichsbahn. This was no ordinary transportation company. It was a national instrument designed to serve the state's needs above all else. Profit mattered. Efficiency mattered more. Obedience mattered most. Trains ran on time because the nation demanded it. Engineers learned to trust numbers over instincts. Schedules replaced judgment. If the paper said a train must leave at a certain minute, it left. If a cargo was listed as freight, it was treated as freight. The system did not ask questions. It executed instructions. When the Nazis came to power, they did not need to invent a new machine. They inherited a perfect one. The railways did not resist. They did not protest. They adapted. Flags were changed. Uniforms adjusted. But the logic remained the same. Move what the state tells you to move. Move it quickly. Move it efficiently. The early years of Nazi rule saw the railways transformed into a symbol of national revival. New locomotives gleamed under fresh paint. Stations were draped in banners. Propaganda films celebrated the beauty of synchronized movement, steel obeying human command. Trains became metaphors for destiny, for unity, for a future that could not be stopped. Every whistle sounded like progress. Behind a spectacle, the bureaucracy tightened its grip. Paperwork multiplied. Forms were standardized. Costs were calculated down to the smallest unit. Fuel consumption, axle load, passenger capacity. Human beings were reduced to figures on a ledger long before they were reduced to ash. No hatred was required to make the trains run. Only compliance. As Germany expanded beyond its borders, the railways expanded with it. Tracks crossed into Austria, then into Czechoslovakia, Poland, and beyond. Each conquest brought new junctions, new depots, new timetables. What had once been a national network became a continental one. Europe was stitched together by German steel. Railway officials traveled ahead of armies, assessing lines, repairing damage, integrating foreign systems into the Reich's master schedule. Different gauges were standardized. Local staff were absorbed or replaced. The trains did not care what language was spoken at the stations, only that the signals matched and the rails aligned. This mattered because control over railways meant control over everything else. Food, weapons, labor, populations. Whoever commanded the tracks commanded the territory. It was domination without gunfire, occupation enforced by schedules and switches. The Reichsbahn's internal culture prized neutrality. Employees were taught they were technicians, not politicians. Engineers, not executioners. Their job was not to ask why a train was running, only how fast it could go and whether it would arrive on time. Morality was not part of the curriculum. Efficiency was. And efficiency demanded detachment. Numbers instead of names. Cargo instead of people. 1,000 units moved from point A to point B. The system did not distinguish between coal, cattle, or human beings. It was never designed to. By the late 1930s, the machinery was complete. The rails were laid. The schedules perfected. The workforce disciplined. All that was missing was a mission that required moving human lives at industrial scale. That mission arrived quietly, disguised as policy. When Jews were expelled from professions, the trains were there. When families were forced to relocate, the trains were there. When borders closed and ghettos formed, the trains fed them with deportees like furnaces consuming fuel. Each step felt incremental, temporary, reversible. The railways normalized the process by making it routine. A departure becomes less shocking when it happens every day. Clerks stamped documents in warm offices far from the tracks. Engineers adjusted valves and checked gauges, hands blackened with grease. Conductors blew whistles and called destinations aloud. None of them saw the end of the line. None of them smelled burning flesh or heard screams behind concrete walls. They heard schedules. They saw manifests. They felt the reassuring vibration of a train doing exactly what it was designed to do. The genius of the system was that it divided responsibility into pieces so small that no one felt the weight of the whole. One man sets a schedule. Another assigns a locomotive. Another opens a signal. Another locks a door. No single action feels like murder. Together, they become genocide. As war returned to Europe, the railways once again proved indispensable. Troops rolled east and west. Tanks rumbled past stations. Prisoners of war were transported by the hundreds of thousands. The lines ran hot with traffic, yet they never stopped. Not for weather. Not for bombing. Not for human suffering. The Reichsbahn prided itself on resilience. Tracks were repaired within hours of air raids. Bridges rebuilt overnight. Detours plotted with mathematical calm. Even destruction became a logistical problem to be solved, not a moral crisis to be confronted. By the time the decision was made to murder entire populations, the infrastructure was ready. The rails did not need to be altered. The schedules did not need to change. Only the labels on the paperwork. What had once been passengers became resettlers. What had once been destinations became processing points. The trains would do the rest. In this system, distance became irrelevant. A village in France was only hours away from a killing center in occupied Poland. A ghetto in Greece could be emptied and refilled on command. Geography no longer offered protection. Time no longer allowed escape. Steel erased space. The horror of what was coming lay not in improvisation, but in preparation. Genocide was not a chaotic eruption of violence. It was a planned operation, made possible by decades of investment in rails, discipline, and obedience. The same trains that once carried holiday travelers now carried mothers and children toward annihilation. And the most terrifying truth was this. Nothing about the trains themselves had to change. The tracks did not turn red overnight. They did not announce what they were about to carry. They simply waited, polished and ready, stretching across Europe like silent promises. In the next chapter, those promises would be fulfilled as paperwork turned into orders, orders into departures, and Europe's railways began transporting human beings not toward life, but toward disappearance. Chapter 2. Paper, timetables, and the bureaucrats of death. The killing did not begin with a scream. It began with a form. A clean sheet of paper laid flat on a desk, its edges squared, its boxes waiting to be filled. Ink scratched softly as names were reduced to numbers, addresses to destinations, lives to quantities. Outside the office window, a train whistle echoed faintly across the yard. Inside, no one looked up. This was not violence. This was administration. The Holocaust advanced not only through hatred and weapons, but through paperwork. Quiet rooms, neat handwriting, rubber stamps pressed down again and again until the page was bruised with approval. The system that would move millions toward death relied on people who never raised their voices, never pulled a trigger, never stood on a ramp deciding who would live or die. Their power lay in their pens. Across Germany and occupied Europe, offices filled with clerks who believed they were far removed from brutality. They wore suits, not uniforms. They worked regular hours. They worried about coffee breaks and promotions, about missing files and incomplete signatures. Their desks smelled of paper dust and ink, not blood. And yet, without them, the trains would never have moved. The language mattered. Words were chosen carefully, stripped of emotion, engineered to conceal reality. Deportation became evacuation. Murder became special treatment. Human beings became units. Entire communities vanished behind phrases like population transfer and labor deployment. The paperwork was not sloppy. It was precise. Precision made it respectable. At the center of this process stood the Reichsbahn, Europe's most powerful transportation apparatus, now fully integrated into the Nazi state. Trains were not dispatched on impulse. Every movement required authorization. Routes had to be approved. Rolling stock allocated. Crews assigned. Fuel calculated. Nothing happened without a paper trail. Invoices were generated for every transport. The cost of a human life was measured in kilometers traveled. Adults were charged full fare. Children were charged half. Infants traveled free. These details were not hidden in secret files. They were entered openly, debated in meetings, corrected when calculations were off. Efficiency demanded accuracy, even when the cargo was human beings bound for death. Railway officials did not ask what happened at the end of the line. Their responsibility ended at arrival. The paperwork was complete once the doors were opened and the train was emptied. What followed was not their department. This division of labor was not accidental. It was the backbone of the system. By fragmenting responsibility, the regime ensured that no single person felt accountable for the outcome. Each clerk handled a piece, so small it seemed harmless. Each approval felt routine. Together, they formed a machine that erased millions. Timetables became instruments of terror. Deportation trains were slotted into schedules alongside passenger services and military transports. They ran at night to avoid attention, or at dawn when stations were quiet. Delays were unacceptable. A late train disrupted the entire network. Efficiency was not a virtue. It was an obligation. Railway dispatchers tracked movement across vast wall maps dotted with pins and lines. Trains advanced steadily eastward, flowing like veins toward industrial centers of killing. When disruptions occurred, alternatives were calculated instantly. Detours plotted. Priorities reassigned. Human suffering was never listed as a variable. The system prized normalcy. Deportation trains were meant to blend in. No dramatic announcements. No visible panic. Just another scheduled movement. This was crucial because the Holocaust depended not only on secrecy, but on social inertia. The less exceptional the transports appeared, the less resistance they provoked. Station masters received orders that were deliberately vague. A transport of Jews. A transport of laborers. A special train. The destination code was often enough. Everyone knew what it meant, yet no one was required to say it aloud. Silence became complicity. Paper insulated the conscience. A clerk processing a list of names did not see faces. He saw columns, totals, adjustments. If a number did not match, it was corrected. If a signature was missing, the file was returned. These were technical errors, not moral ones. The system trained its workers to think this way. As deportations expanded, the bureaucracy swelled. New offices were created, new forms printed, new procedures refined. Meetings were held to streamline the process, to increase capacity, to reduce bottlenecks. This was not a breakdown of civilization. It was civilization functioning efficiently in the service of murder. Orders flowed downward, responsibility flowed upward, and accountability disappeared somewhere in between. A transport might involve dozens of individuals, each doing a small task, none of whom felt they were committing a crime. This was the genius and the horror of the system. When Jews were rounded up, local authorities compiled lists. Names, birth dates, professions, addresses. The lists were checked, corrected, and forwarded. Railway offices received the numbers and converted them into capacity requirements. How many boxcars were needed? How many guards? How many kilometers? The people vanished into mathematics. There were moments when the system faltered, when too many transports were scheduled at once, when military needs clashed with deportations, when tracks were damaged or rolling stock was scarce. In those moments, discussions did not revolve around human consequences. They revolved around priorities. Again and again, deportation trains were given precedence. Food shipments could wait. Passenger services could be delayed. But the transports had to run. The machine had to be fed. The bureaucracy learned quickly. Early deportations were inefficient, chaotic, prone to delays. By 1942, the process was refined. Forms standardized. Procedures simplified. Communication streamlined. What had once been improvised became routine. Murder acquired a rhythm. Railway accounting departments tracked revenue generated by deportations. This was not metaphorical profit. It was literal income. The Reichsbahn billed the SS. Payments were recorded. Balances were reconciled. Even genocide was expected to pay its way. Some clerks knew exactly what they were doing. Others pretended not to. Many convinced themselves that someone else was responsible for the worst part. The paperwork allowed for this self-deception. A form does not scream. A ledger does not beg. The soundscape of this bureaucracy was mundane. The scrape of chairs. The rustle of paper. The clack of typewriter keys. Outside, trains came and went. Inside, lives were erased one signature at a time. What made the system so effective was its banality. Nothing about it looked monstrous. There were no bloodstains on the documents. No cries recorded in the margins. Only clean lines and official seals. The genocide was disguised as governance. As deportations spread across Europe, the same bureaucratic logic was exported with them. Occupied countries were integrated into the system. Local railways coordinated with German authorities. Paperwork crossed borders, even when people were forbidden to. The Holocaust became an international administrative effort. Every successful transport reinforced the illusion that this was simply how things were done. The repetition numbed moral reflexes. When something happens every day, it stops feeling extraordinary. The paperwork ensured that the extraordinary became routine. And yet, cracks appeared. Mistakes were made. Trains arrived with bodies already dead. Schedules collapsed under strain. Reports mentioned losses during transport. These were treated as logistical issues, not tragedies. Adjustments were made. Ventilation holes added. Guards instructed to unload faster. The machine learned from suffering. The bureaucracy did not merely facilitate genocide. It normalized it. By wrapping mass murder in procedures and protocols, it made participation easier. Refusal became deviation. Obedience became professionalism. At no point did the system require most participants to confront the full reality of what they were enabling. The paperwork ensured distance. Distance ensured compliance. Compliance ensured that the trains kept moving. By the time the Holocaust reached its peak, the bureaucracy was no longer reacting. It was anticipating. Trains were scheduled before arrests were completed. Capacity was allocated before people were loaded. The system ran ahead of the violence, pulling it forward with inexorable momentum. The horror was not hidden in chaos, but in order. Not in secrecy, but in documentation. The Holocaust was one of the most thoroughly recorded crimes in history, not because its perpetrators wanted it remembered, but because they could not imagine a world where such records would be judged. Every stamp, every signature, every timetable entry was a small act. Together, they formed a record of complicity so vast it became invisible to those inside it. As this chapter closes, the paper trail has been laid. The schedules are set. The clerks have done their work. The trains are waiting on their tracks, doors open, engines idling, ready to receive the human cargo that the bureaucracy has already reduced to numbers. In the next chapter, those numbers will be forced into boxcars, and the paperwork will finally acquire a sound, a smell, and a weight that no ledger could ever contain. Chapter 3, From Neighbors to Cargo, The First Deportations, 1939 to 1941. It began quietly, almost politely. A knock at the door, firm but not violent. Boots on stone steps. A voice calling a name that had been spoken in that apartment for generations. Inside, the smell of morning bread still hung in the air. A coat lay folded on a chair. Someone was told to pack a small bag. Just the essentials. Just for relocation. Just temporary. Outside, a train waited, breathing steam into the cold. In the earliest years, the deportations did not yet announce themselves as a death sentence. They were framed as movement, reassignment, resettlement. The words mattered because they allowed neighbors to keep watching without intervening. They allowed officials to carry out orders without confronting their meaning. And they allowed the victims to hope, even as the ground beneath them disappeared. When the war began in 1939, Germany did not immediately transport Jews to extermination camps. The system was still forming. What existed instead was displacement on a massive scale. People were uprooted from homes they had lived in for decades and pushed eastward into unfamiliar territory. The violence was real, but it was bureaucratic violence, delivered through orders and transport lists rather than bullets. Trains filled with families left cities like Berlin, Vienna, and Prague. These were not cattle cars yet. These were passenger coaches, second-class compartments with hard benches and curtained windows. The humiliation lay not in the conditions, but in the destination. People were not told where they were going, only that they no longer belonged where they were. As the trains crossed borders into occupied Poland, the landscape changed. Stations became quieter. Guards became rougher. The air smelled of coal smoke and fear. People pressed their faces to windows, searching for clues in passing fields and villages, trying to memorize a world that was slipping away. The destinations were ghettos, sealed districts carved out of existing cities. Places like Lodz, Warsaw, Krakow, neighborhoods surrounded by walls, barbed wire, and armed patrols. The trains did not deliver people to death yet. They delivered them to waiting. Waiting was its own form of punishment. Inside the ghettos, space collapsed. Apartments meant for one family held 5, then 10. Hallways became bedrooms. Stairwells became kitchens. The smell of unwashed bodies mixed with rotting food and sewage. Hunger settled into bones and refused to leave. The trains continued to arrive. Each transport added pressure to an already starving population. The railways made this possible. They turned displacement into routine. A few hundred people here, 1,000 there. The numbers grew, but the mechanism remained the same. What made these early deportations so effective was their gradual nature. There was no single moment of mass outrage. No clear line that separated before from after. Each train felt like an exception. Each order felt temporary. By the time the pattern became visible, it was already entrenched. People who had once been neighbors were now treated as inventory. Lists were compiled by street, by building, by surname. The trains did not discriminate between the elderly and the young. If a name was on the list, the body followed. In Vienna, Jewish families were marched through streets they had walked freely only months earlier. Neighbors watched from windows, some in silence, some with curiosity, some with satisfaction. The trains waited at stations where the same families had once departed for holidays and business trips. Now they departed under guard, carrying only what they could hold. The physical sensation of deportation was disorienting. The jolt of movement as the train pulled away. The sudden realization that there would be no return ticket. The way familiar landmarks vanished, replaced by endless stretches of track. Time stretched and folded in on itself. Hours felt like days. Days blurred together. For many, the ghettos were meant to be a holding phase, a temporary solution, while Nazi planners debated the so-called Jewish question. But temporary solutions have a way of becoming permanent when they are efficient. The trains made it easy to keep adding people without addressing the consequences. Inside the ghettos, survival became a daily negotiation. Food rations were calculated to starve slowly, not quickly. Just enough to keep bodies alive for labor. Not enough to sustain health. Children's bellies swelled. Old people faded. Disease spread through overcrowded rooms like smoke through cracks. The trains kept coming anyway. The deportations were not chaotic. They were synchronized. Ghettos were filled according to capacity calculations that existed only on paper. When one ghetto reached its breaking point, planners adjusted routes. New destinations were selected. The railways adapted without pause. In occupied Poland, entire Jewish communities from small towns were wiped off the map. People were rounded up in market squares and marched to nearby stations. They boarded trains bound for ghettos they had never heard of. The rhythm was relentless. Arrest, transport, confinement, repeat. For the victims, the uncertainty was unbearable. They did not know whether this was the end or merely the beginning. Rumors circulated. Some said they would be sent to work. Others whispered about camps. No one yet spoke openly about gas chambers. The worst horrors were still unimaginable. That uncertainty was part of the system's power. Hope delayed resistance. If survival seemed possible, even faintly, people clung to it. The trains exploited that hope by offering movement instead of finality. The sensory experience of these early transports differed from what would come later, but the fear was no less real. The clatter of wheels on rails echoed through compartments filled with whispered prayers and stifled sobs. The smell of sweat and fear soaked into clothing. Children cried until they were too tired to cry anymore. Guards walked the aisles, rifles slung casually over shoulders, boots thudding against the floor. They were not always brutal. Sometimes they were bored. That boredom was its own cruelty. It suggested that this suffering was unremarkable. In the ghettos, the sound of trains became a constant presence. Whistles in the distance, the rumble of arrivals, the metallic scream of brakes. Each sound carried dread. Every arrival meant fewer resources. Every departure meant families tore apart. Some deportees tried to document what was happening. Diaries were hidden under floorboards. Notes were smuggled out. Words scratched on scraps of paper described hunger, fear, and disbelief. These records did not stop the trains, but they ensured that silence would not be complete. The Nazi leadership watched these developments closely. Ghettos proved useful, but imperfect. They required food deliveries. They bred disease. They attracted attention. Most importantly, they did not eliminate the population. They merely concentrated it. The trains, however, had proven their value. They could move people across borders without resistance. They could do so quietly. They could do so at scale. The infrastructure was there. The bureaucracy was refined. What remained was a decision about purpose. By 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union transformed everything. Mass shootings followed the advancing armies. Entire communities were wiped out in forests and ravines. But bullets were inefficient. They required manpower. They took time. They traumatized the killers. Once again, the solution pointed back to the railways. The experience gained during the early deportations mattered. The state had learned how to identify, isolate, and transport populations. It had learned how to coordinate police, railways, and administrators. It had learned how to make disappearance look like relocation. The trains had already severed people from their homes, their neighbors, their identities. Turning them from citizens into cargo was no longer a conceptual leap. It was an administrative adjustment. Inside the ghettos, whispers grew darker. People noticed that those taken away did not return. That destinations changed. That the language shifted. Resettlement began to sound less like relocation and more like erasure. Still, the trains continued to arrive and depart, relentless as ever. Each one carried not just bodies, but the accumulated despair of a population stripped of agency. The early deportations had softened the ground. They had accustomed Europe to the sight of Jews being moved like property. This normalization was crucial. When the machinery of extermination was unleashed, it would not shock the system. It would simply accelerate it. For those caught in these first waves, the cruelty lay not only in what was done to them, but in what they were forced to anticipate. They lived suspended between past and future, knowing their old lives were gone, but unable to imagine what awaited them. The trains embodied that suspension. They moved, but never toward safety. They promised change, but delivered confinement. They carried people away from home without delivering them to a place where life could begin again. By the end of 1941, the illusion of temporary suffering was collapsing. The ghettos were overflowing. Death rates soared. The war expanded. And somewhere behind closed doors, plans were being finalized to transform the railways from tools of displacement into instruments of annihilation. The neighbors had become cargo. The cargo was being sorted. And the trains, already tested and proven, stood ready to carry the Holocaust into its next and deadliest phase. Chapter 4. Ghettos as Holding Pens. The walls went up first. Brick by brick, plank by plank, topped with barbed wire that caught the light like teeth. Streets that had once been busy with vendors and children were suddenly severed, cut off from the rest of the city as if amputated. Gates appeared where roads had been. Guards stood where neighbors once lingered. Overnight, familiar places became sealed worlds, and the trains began delivering people into spaces that were never meant to hold so many lives. Inside the ghettos, time behaved differently. Days dragged, heavy and airless, while weeks vanished in a blur of hunger and exhaustion. The first arrivals still believed this confinement was temporary. They told themselves it was a wartime measure, a precaution, a step toward relocation. The trains had brought them here, and surely the trains would take them somewhere better. Hope clung stubbornly, even as reality pressed in from all sides. The sensory assault was immediate. Overcrowded apartments reeked of sweat, damp clothing, and human waste. Stairwells echoed with coughing that never seemed to stop. The smell of boiling cabbage water drifted through hallways, thin and mocking, promising nourishment it could not deliver. Floors were cold under bare feet. Walls sweated with condensation. Privacy ceased to exist. The ghettos were not designed to sustain life. They were designed to contain it. Every calculation reflected that purpose. Food rations were deliberately insufficient, calibrated to weaken but not immediately kill. A slow starvation that hollowed bodies and dulled resistance. Hunger became the dominant sensation, a constant gnawing that never let go, not even in sleep. Children learned hunger before they learned fear. Their faces grew sharp, eyes too large for skulls that seemed to shrink by the day. Mothers tore crusts of bread into ever smaller pieces, counting bites like seconds. Fathers stood in endless lines for rations that could not feed a family for a day. The sound of stomachs growling became as common as footsteps. The trains kept coming. Each new transport tipped the balance further. Space collapsed. A room meant for one family now held 3, then 5, then 10. People slept sitting up, leaning against each other like fallen dominoes. When someone died in the night, their body remained until morning because there was nowhere to put it. Death became part of the landscape, unremarkable in its frequency. The ghettos functioned as holding pens, places where people were stored while decisions were made elsewhere. This waiting was intentional. It broke spirits. It eroded identity. It reduced human beings to a state where survival consumed every thought, leaving no energy for resistance. The trains delivered bodies into this limbo, and the walls ensured they could not leave. Disease thrived in these conditions. Typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery. Illness spread through touch, through breath, through shared water, and shared despair. The sick lay beside the healthy because separation was impossible. Doctors worked without medicine. Nurses reused bandages until they disintegrated. The smell of sickness joined the smell of hunger, a sour, clinging odor that seeped into clothing and skin. Outside the walls, life continued. Trams ran. Shops opened. People went to work. The ghettos existed within cities, yet felt like another planet, invisible unless one chose to look. The trains that brought people in did not disrupt the rhythm outside. They arrived quietly, unloaded their cargo, and left. Inside, the sound of trains carried a different meaning. The distant whistle became a warning, a signal that more mouths were about to arrive, more competition for already scarce resources. Each arrival was met with a mix of dread and recognition. Newcomers still had coats, sometimes jewelry, sometimes savings. Old residents knew those things would not last. An underground economy emerged almost immediately. Smuggling became a lifeline. Children slipped through cracks in walls, under fences, across rooftops, carrying bread and potatoes hidden under their clothes. Guards sometimes looked the other way. Sometimes they did not. Shots rang out without warning. Bodies fell in streets already crowded with suffering. The trains had turned displacement into permanence. People could not leave, yet they were not allowed to build a life inside. Work assignments changed constantly. Rules shifted without notice. Punishments were arbitrary. Stability was impossible by design. The psychological toll was immense. People measured time not by calendars, but by losses. Who had died? Who had disappeared? Who had been taken by the last transport? Families dissolved gradually, not always through death, but through separation, exhaustion, and despair. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said the ghettos were the worst of it. Others whispered about camps where work awaited. Stories circulated of places farther east. No one knew what to believe, and the uncertainty gnawed at the mind as fiercely as hunger gnawed at the body. The trains reinforced that uncertainty. Departures were announced with little warning. Lists were posted. Names read aloud. People gathered in squares clutching documents. Children, bundles of possessions. They were told they were being moved for work, for resettlement, for their own good. The language was always administrative, never violent. Those left behind watched as friends and relatives were marched to stations, loaded onto trains, and taken away. They waited for news that never came. Days passed. Weeks. Silence settled in. Absence became confirmation. The ghettos taught people how to disappear. And still, the system insisted on order. Councils were formed inside the ghettos, forced to administer the unadministrable. They compiled lists, distributed rations, organized labor. These councils existed under impossible pressure, trapped between the demands of the occupiers and the desperation of their own people. Their role was another layer of insulation, another way to distance perpetrators from consequences. The trains benefited from this structure. Orders came through official channels. Deportations were framed as administrative necessities. The victims were made to participate in the process of their own removal, signing papers, reporting as instructed, hoping compliance might mean survival. Every train that departed made the ghettos slightly emptier, slightly quieter. For a moment, resources stretched a little further. For a moment, space opened up. These moments were deceptive. They suggested relief, when in fact they were rehearsals for something worse. As months passed, death rates inside the ghettos rivaled those of open violence. People collapsed in streets from hunger. Corpses were collected daily, stacked on carts like refuse. Burial rites were abbreviated or abandoned. There was no time, no strength, no space for mourning. The walls did more than contain bodies. They contained information. News from outside arrived distorted, delayed, filtered through rumor. People inside knew the world was changing, that the war was expanding, but they did not know how fast or how far. Isolation magnified fear. The trains exploited that isolation. They arrived without explanation and departed without trace. They carried people away from sight, away from memory. The ghettos made disappearance seem normal. Children adapted in ways that haunt the historical record. They scavenged, traded, stole, learned to read danger in the smallest gestures. Childhood shrank to survival skills. Laughter became rare, then suspicious, then almost forgotten. Adults aged rapidly. Hair grayed, backs bent. Hope eroded not through sudden catastrophe, but through endless deprivation. The ghettos did not kill quickly. They exhausted life. The Nazis observed this with interest. Ghettos had proven useful as a method of control and concentration, but they were inefficient. They required oversight. They generated disease that threatened to spread. They produced corpses that had to be disposed of. Most importantly, they did not fulfill the ideological goal of complete removal. The trains, however, remained reliable. By concentrating populations in ghettos, the regime had solved the hardest problem of genocide: identification and accessibility. People were no longer scattered across cities and villages. They were contained, counted, and ready for transport. The ghettos were not the end. They were staging grounds. As 1941 progressed, the atmosphere inside the ghettos darkened. Deportations increased. The language grew colder. The intervals between transports shortened. People sensed a shift, an acceleration. Something final was approaching, even if its shape remained unclear. Those who could still think beyond hunger began to understand that the ghettos were not meant to endure. They were temporary by design, but not in the way anyone had hoped. Temporary as a warehouse is temporary before goods are shipped onward. The trains waited just beyond the walls. At night, the sound of engines idling carried through empty streets. People lay awake listening, counting whistles, trying to guess where the next train would go. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of movement, of escape, of arrival at places that did not exist. The ghettos stripped people of choices. Stay or go was not a decision. Work or starve was not a choice. Obedience became a survival strategy, even as it fed the machine that was destroying them. By the time the ghettos were firmly established across occupied Europe, the system had achieved what it needed. Millions of people were contained, weakened, documented, and accessible. The trains had delivered them into holding pens, and the walls ensured they could not scatter. What remained was to decide their final destination. As this chapter closes, the ghettos stand full, bursting with life that has been reduced to waiting. Hunger has softened bodies. Fear has dulled resistance. The trains have rehearsed their routes. And beyond the walls, plans are being finalized to empty these holding pens completely, sending their inhabitants not to another place of confinement, but to places designed for one purpose alone. Chapter 5. The Shift to Extermination. The decision did not announce itself with sirens or speeches. It arrived in silence, carried through corridors, sealed in folders, spoken in rooms where windows were closed and voices kept low. Somewhere between a signature and a nod, the purpose of the trains changed. They would no longer move people simply to isolate them. They would move them to erase them. By the time the shift began, The machinery was already in motion. The ghettos were full. The railways were proven. The bureaucracy was disciplined. What had started as removal had become concentration, and concentration demanded resolution. The war had expanded, violence had escalated, and the Nazi leadership confronted a problem they believed could not be postponed. Millions of people remained alive under German control. Alive, visible, and unwanted. The invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 marked the point of no return. The war in the East was not fought like earlier campaigns. It was ideological, racial, and merciless. Behind advancing armies came mobile killing units, shooting entire communities in fields, forests, and ravines. The earth swallowed bodies by the thousands. Gunfire echoed for days. These massacres were efficient in their brutality, but they exposed a problem the regime had not anticipated. Shooting people face to face took a toll on the shooters. Reports spoke of drunkenness, breakdowns, refusals. Bullets had to be manufactured, transported, replaced. Grave had to be dug. The killing left traces, witnesses, trauma. The leadership wanted a method that was quieter, cleaner, more controllable, something that did not rely on individual men pulling triggers day after day, something that could be scaled. The answer lay in what had already been built. The railways offered distance. They allowed murder to be separated from decision. A man signing a transport order did not see blood. A dispatcher routing a train did not hear screams. The killing could be relocated to places designed for it, hidden from public view, insulated from conscience. This was the moment when deportation became extermination. The language shifted first. Orders no longer spoke vaguely of resettlement or labor alone. New euphemisms appeared, colder and more final. Special handling, final processing, treatment, words emptied of meaning, chosen precisely because they concealed it. The ghettos, once intended as long-term containment, were now obstacles. They consumed resources. They bred disease. They reminded the outside world that the Jewish population still existed. The solution was not to improve conditions. It was to empty them. Trains were the only way to do this quickly enough. Railway planners recalculated routes. Capacity was reassessed. New destinations were selected, always farther east, always closer to forests and rail junctions, always away from prying eyes. Camps that had once functioned as labor sites or detention centers were redesigned. New facilities were built where tracks ran directly inside the perimeter. The sensory reality of this shift was invisible at first to those trapped inside the ghettos. Deportations had been happening for months already. People were used to lists, to announcements, to forced departures. What changed was not the process, but the outcome. Earlier transports had led to confinement and slow death. Now they led to immediate annihilation. The first victims did not know this. They boarded trains believing the familiar lies because those lies had worked before. Work, relocation, survival through compliance. Hope lingered, fragile but stubborn, clinging to any version of the future that did not end in a grave. The trains themselves did not change overnight. Locomotives still hissed. Wheels still shrieked. Schedules were still followed. But the destinations now had a single purpose, and everything about the system aligned to serve it. The Reichsbahn continued to bill for transports, as it always had. Kilometers traveled. Numbers carried. Nothing in the accounting revealed the shift in intent. The paperwork remained clinical, detached, serene. This detachment was essential. It allowed extermination to masquerade as logistics. The railways did not kill, officials could claim. They only transported. Responsibility was diluted until it vanished. As plans solidified, coordination intensified. Police forces synchronized roundups with rail schedules. Ghettos were emptied section by section. Streets once crowded with life fell silent. Apartments stood abandoned, doors swinging open, belongings scattered where families had been ordered to leave them. The sound of trains departing grew more frequent. Whistles pierced the air at dawn, at dusk, at night. Each departure took thousands. Each arrival delivered them to places where the rails ended beside concrete, barbed wire, and smoke. The secrecy surrounding these new destinations was deliberate. Even many lower-level officials did not know what happened at the end of the line. They did not need to. Their task was to ensure that trains arrived on time, that doors remained sealed, that no one escaped. Distance protected them. Moral distance, physical distance, psychological distance. The victims, however, felt the shift in their bodies. Conditions on the trains worsened. Passenger cars gave way to boxcars. Space shrank. Air disappeared. Water was withheld. The journey itself became lethal. People died standing up, crushed against one another, their bodies held upright by the sheer pressure of the crowd. The trains were no longer just transportation. They were part of the killing process. The war provided cover. Bombings, troop movements, shortages. Amid this chaos, deportation trains moved steadily, their priority often equal to or greater than military traffic. When tracks were damaged, they were repaired. When fuel was scarce, it was allocated. The extermination schedule was non-negotiable. The state had crossed a threshold. The question was no longer how to manage an unwanted population, but how to eliminate it completely and efficiently. The answer lay in the integration of railways, camps, and bureaucracy into a single, seamless system. The camps themselves were designed around the trains. Ramps were constructed to receive transports directly. Paths led from boxcars to selection areas to killing sites. The flow was intentional, rehearsed, optimized. The victims were processed the way raw materials were processed in factories. This industrial logic permeated everything. Trains arrived full and left empty. The cycle repeated. Each transport refined the procedure. Each mistake was corrected. Delays were eliminated. The system learned. Inside the ghettos, rumors hardened into dread. People noticed that deportees never sent letters, that no packages returned, that destinations changed names or disappeared entirely. Fear spread, but options were gone. Resistance was nearly impossible. Hunger had done its work. Some sensed that boarding a train now meant something fundamentally different. Desperation drove impossible choices. Hiding, forged papers, escapes through sewers. For most, these paths were closed before they could be tried. The trains did not slow. If anything, they accelerated. The psychological transformation was as significant as the logistical one. The state had moved from managing a problem to erasing it. This shift required not just infrastructure, but a mindset that accepted mass murder as a technical challenge to be solved. That mindset was already in place. The men who scheduled trains spoke in neutral terms. The men who guarded transports followed orders. The men who built camps focused on capacity. At every stage, the work could be framed as professional duty. The victims became abstract. They were no longer neighbors, no longer citizens, no longer even prisoners. They were numbers in motion, units flowing through a system designed to end their existence. The trains were the arteries of that system. As the extermination phase took shape, it fed on momentum. Each successful transport made the next easier. Each emptied ghetto-freed space to receive more deportees. The system became self-perpetuating, driven by its own efficiency. Stopping it would have required not a single act of defiance, but a collapse of coordination across institutions that had already proven their willingness to cooperate. That collapse never came. By late 1941 and early 1942, the shift was complete. Deportation no longer meant displacement. It meant death, delivered with bureaucratic calm and mechanical precision. Those who signed the orders rarely saw the results. Those who saw the results rarely signed the orders. The trains connected them without forcing confrontation. The sound of the rails remained the same. The smell of coal smoke still filled stations. To the outside world, little appeared to have changed. But inside the system, a line had been crossed from which there was no return. The ghettos were no longer holding pens. They were reservoirs feeding a machine designed to drain them dry. The trains were no longer pathways to confinement. They were conduits to annihilation. As this chapter ends, the shift has been made. The destinations are ready. The schedules are set. The language has been sanitized. And the trains, already proven capable of moving millions, now carry a new and final purpose, one that will define the darkest phase of the Holocaust to come. Chapter 6: Cattle Cars and Sealed Doors. The doors slammed shut with a sound that echoed inside the car like a gunshot. Iron met iron. Bolts slid into place. From the outside, hands tested the lock, tugged once, then moved on. Inside, darkness swallowed the space almost immediately. The air changed. What little breeze had existed vanished, replaced by the thick, warm breath of dozens, then hundreds, of people pressed together with nowhere to move. The train jerked forward. The journey began. These were not passenger trains anymore. The benches were gone. The windows were sealed or barred. The cars were built for animals and freight, not human beings. Wood rough with splinters scraped skin. Nails protruded from warped planks. The floor was coated with old straw, soaked with the residue of whatever had been carried before. Manure, oil, rot. The smell rose as soon as the doors closed, heavy and suffocating. People were packed so tightly they could not sit. Many could not lift their arms. Children were held above heads in desperate attempts to keep them from being crushed. The elderly sagged where they stood, supported only by the bodies around them. Every breath was shared. Every movement rippled through the mass. The train began to gather speed. Wheels clattered rhythmically, the sound vibrating through bones and teeth. At first, some still spoke. Whispers, prayers, reassurances spoken more for the speaker than the listener. Someone knocked on the door, then again, harder. A voice called out for water. There was no response. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time inside the car lost meaning almost immediately. Heat built fast, especially in summer. Sweat soaked clothing until fabric clung to skin. The air grew wet, heavy with carbon dioxide. Breathing became work. Each inhale felt thinner than the last. There was no toilet, no bucket, no corner that offered privacy. When the first person could no longer hold it, shame rippled through the car, quickly overtaken by necessity. Urine soaked into the straw. Feces smeared across boots and hems. The stench became overpowering, burning eyes and throats. Some retched. Others no longer had the energy. Water was either non-existent or brutally inadequate. A single bucket for dozens of people, empty long before the first day ended. Lips cracked. Tongues swelled. Children cried until their voices rasped into silence. Mothers pressed dry mouths to dry skin, unable to help. The train did not stop for them. As night fell, temperatures dropped. Wet clothing clung cold to bodies. The same lack of space that trapped heat earlier now trapped chill. People shivered violently, teeth chattering, muscles cramping. Those who had collapsed earlier did not always rise again. Death arrived quietly. A person slumped, head dropping forward. At first, others assumed sleep. Then the body grew heavier, dead weight pressing into living flesh. There was nowhere to lay the dead down. Corpses remained upright, held in place by the living, swaying with the movement of the train. By morning, the car smelled of decay, layered atop human waste and fear. The straw was slick. The air burned lungs. Every breath felt borrowed. People begged for air, for water, for the doors to be opened. Some screamed until their voices failed. Some went silent early, retreating inward, conserving what little strength remained. The guards outside heard the noise. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they ignored it. Sometimes they struck the sides of the car with rifle butts to quiet the screaming. The door stayed shut. The design was intentional. Sealed cars prevented escape. Overcrowding maximized capacity. Suffering was not an accident. It was tolerated, then accepted, then normalized. The trains were meant to deliver people alive if possible, but alive was never a requirement. The destination mattered more than the condition of the cargo. Children were the first to fade. Dehydration claimed them quickly. Small bodies could not regulate heat. Mothers felt their limbs go limp in their arms. Some refused to let go even after life had left them, clinging to the weight as if it could still be warmed back in a breath. The living made room for the dead, only when forced to. A body slipping to the floor created a void that others rushed to fill, desperate for a fraction more air. The dead were stepped on, leaned against, cursed, prayed over. Respect dissolved under pressure. As the train rattled on, people began to lose awareness. The lack of oxygen induced dizziness, confusion, hallucinations. Some spoke to loved ones who were not there. Others laughed suddenly, then collapsed. The smell became unbearable, yet unavoidable. It soaked into hair, into skin, into memory. At stops, sometimes the doors opened briefly. A rush of fresh air exploded into the car like a miracle. People gasped, sucked in greedily. Guards might throw in a bucket of water, already mostly gone by the time it hit the floor. Sometimes bodies were removed. Sometimes they were not. The doors slammed shut again. Darkness returned. These pauses were cruel. They reminded the trapped of what they were missing. Air, space, dignity, life. The journeys lasted hours, days, sometimes more than a week. The length depended on distance, rail traffic, military priorities. Deportation trains were often shunted onto sidings to let troop trains pass. People waited motionless for hours, pressed together, the sun beating down or frost creeping in. Winter transports were no kinder. Breath froze in the air. Condensation formed on walls, turning to ice. People huddled for warmth, sharing body heat with strangers. Those who slipped to the floor sometimes froze before anyone realized they were dying. Every sense was assaulted. The constant noise of wheels hammered nerves raw. The darkness disoriented. The smell made eyes water. The touch of strangers never ceased. Emotionally, terror blended with resignation. Some prayed. Some cursed. Some dissociated, staring at nothing, retreating into numbness. The trains erased individuality. Names ceased to matter. Only bodies counted. Space was measured in inches. Survival depended on strength, position, chance. The weak fell first. The very young and the very old followed. The system learned from these transports. Reports noted losses during transit. Adjustments were made. Sometimes vents were cut into walls. Sometimes not. Sometimes fewer people were loaded. Sometimes more. The goal was not to reduce suffering. It was to ensure enough survivors arrived to be processed. The cruelty lay in that calculation. For those who died en route, there was no record, no grave, no acknowledgement. Their deaths existed only as discrepancies in transport numbers. A column adjusted, a note scribbled in the margin. The train moved on. For those who survived the journey, arrival brought no relief. The doors opened onto barking orders, blinding light, dogs, smoke. Bodies collapsed onto platforms, muscles unable to support weight. The living stumbled over the dead, too exhausted to care. But inside the cars, during the journey itself, people still did not know what awaited them. Even then, some clung to hope. The ordeal had been so extreme that survival felt like victory. Surely nothing worse could follow. Surely this was the hardest part. The trains exploited that belief. They broke people down before delivering them to places where resistance would be impossible. Hunger, dehydration, and terror weakened bodies and minds. By the time the doors opened, many were already defeated. The cattle cars were not a deviation from a system. They were its logical extension. They turned transport into punishment, movement into suffering, distance into death. From the outside, the trains looked ordinary. Boxcars rolling through countryside, smoke trailing behind engines. Villagers watched them pass, hearing muffled sounds they did not want to identify. The trains did not stop in town centers. They did not announce their purpose. They passed through like ghosts. Inside, humanity was being stripped away mile by mile. The sealed doors symbolized the final loss of agency. Once closed, there was no negotiation, no appeal, no escape. The state had complete control over time, space, and fate. The rails dictated direction. The schedule dictated duration. The doors dictated survival. By the time the train slowed for its final approach, the car was unrecognizable from when it departed. People who had boarded upright emerged crawling. Faces were gray, eyes hollow, clothing soaked and torn. Some did not emerge at all. The cattle cars had done their work. As this chapter ends, the trains are still moving. Wheels still turning. Doors still sealed. Inside, bodies are pressed together in darkness, unaware that the suffering of the journey is only the threshold. Ahead lie platforms, selections, and a system designed to finish what the trains have begun. Chapter 7. Across a continent. Europe on the rails of death. The train crossed borders without slowing. There were no announcements, no flags changing outside the windows, no indication that one country had ended and another had begun. Inside the sealed cars, geography no longer existed. People were carried through nations they had never seen, through landscapes they would never touch, across a continent that had quietly agreed to let them pass in darkness. This was the true scale of what the trains made possible. Not a local crime, not a regional atrocity, but a continental operation, synchronized across Europe, timed to the minute, feeding millions of human beings into a single murderous system. The rails connected capitals to killing grounds, neighborhoods to smoke, homes to ash. Distance, once a barrier, had been conquered by steel. From the west, trains departed from Paris, Brussels, Amsterdam, and Rome. From the south, they came out of Greece, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria. From the north, Norway and Denmark. From the heart of Central Europe, Germany and Austria. From the east, the occupied territories of Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. Every direction led inward, toward a shrinking set of destinations hidden behind euphemisms and forests. Each journey was different in length, but identical in purpose. A Jew arrested in France might spend days rattling eastward, shunted on his sidings to allow military traffic to pass. The car would grow hotter, then colder, then hot again as the train crawled through stations and countryside. Somewhere along the route, another transport might be attached, merging human cargo from different nations, languages, and cultures into a single mass of suffering. By the time they arrived, accents no longer mattered. Only breath did. In the Netherlands, people were told they were being sent to work camps. They boarded trains carrying suitcases, tools, family photographs. In Greece, entire communities were loaded at once, Ladino prayers echoing in cars that would soon fall silent. In Hungary, transports left with terrifying speed, sometimes several in a single day, overwhelming even the rail system with their frequency. The coordination required was immense. Different rail networks, different gauges, different administrations. And yet, the trains ran. Timetables were aligned. Borders opened. Guards were exchanged. The Reichsbahn coordinated with local rail authorities who provided locomotives, crews, and track access. Deportation became an international logistical achievement. No single country could claim ignorance. Each provided a piece of the route. Each stamped documents. Each cleared tracks. Each watched trains arrive full and depart empty. Responsibility dissolved across borders, just as it had across offices. Inside the cars, the passengers sensed the length of the journey through exhaustion. Muscles cramped. Throats burned. Bodies leaned more heavily as strength faded. Children stopped crying not because they were calm, but because they were empty. The sound of the train became a constant companion, a grinding rhythm that erased all other thoughts. For many, the journey lasted longer than any trip they had ever taken in their lives. And yet, there was no destination to anticipate, no platform of arrival that promised rest. Only movement, endless, punishing movement. The trains passed through cities at night. Lights flickered through cracks in the boards. People pressed faces to slits, glimpsing cafes, street lamps, couples walking arm in arm. Ordinary life, inches away. The contrast was unbearable. Some screamed for help. Some pounded the walls. The train did not stop. In rural areas, farmers paused in fields as boxcars rolled past. They heard muffled sounds, smelled something wrong. They told themselves it was livestock. They told themselves it was prisoners. They told themselves it was not their concern. The trains made denial easy by never lingering. As deportations expanded, entire rail corridors became arteries of death. Certain junctions saw dozens of transports a week. Signals flicked endlessly from red to green. Switches clanked under the weight of trains that carried nothing but despair. The system adapted to volume. Cars were reused without cleaning. Straw was replaced only when it disintegrated. The stench accumulated, layer upon layer, until each new transport inherited the suffering of the last. History soaked into the wood. People from different countries met in these cars. They could not communicate easily, but pain required no translation. Hands reached out in darkness. Water was shared when it existed. Bodies leaned together for warmth. Cultural differences dissolved under pressure. For some, the journey brought the first realization that this was not relocation. They noticed how far east they were going. They recognized station names from rumors. They sensed that no letters ever arrived from those taken before. Fear hardened into something colder, heavier. Still, hope resisted in fragments. Humans cling to hope, even when it hurts, even when it prolongs suffering. The trains exploited this instinct mercilessly. As the transports converged on occupied Poland, rail traffic thickened. Lines clogged. Sidings filled with waiting trains. Engines idling for hours or days. Inside, people stood motionless, conserving energy, waiting for movement to resume. Some died during these pauses, bodies slumping unnoticed until the train finally moved again. The smell inside became overwhelming. Waste, sickness, death, fear. It clung to hair and skin. It burned lungs. It seeped into memory. Survivors would carry it for the rest of their lives, unable to forget, even decades later. The guards rotated. Crews changed. Paperwork moved smoothly from one desk to another. The trains themselves did not care who drove them or where they came from. They followed tracks laid long before the war, tracks built for commerce and connection, now repurposed for annihilation. At certain points, the cars were opened briefly. Dead bodies were dragged out, dumped beside tracks, or left on platforms. Survivors were shoved back inside. No explanation was given. The doors closed again. The journey continued. For those still alive, the removal of the dead brought no comfort. It meant fewer bodies to lean against, less support to keep standing. It meant more space for despair. Europe was shrinking. Cities that had once felt distant now blurred together. Names lost meaning. The only direction that mattered was east. Always east. The trains ran through landscapes scarred by war. Burned villages. Cratered fields. Ruined stations. These sites reinforced the sense that the world itself was collapsing. If civilization could destroy itself this thoroughly, what chance did a sealed boxcar of people have? The victims were not ignorant of danger. They felt it in their bones. They smelled it in the air. But danger without clarity is paralyzing. Without knowing how or when death would come, resistance felt impossible. The trains ensured that paralysis. For railway workers, these long-distance transports became routine. They complained about delays, about damaged cars, about overworked engines. Rarely did they complain about the cargo. Professionalism demanded focus on the task, not its consequences. Some knew exactly where the trains were going. Others pretended not to. Many convinced themselves that the responsibility lay elsewhere. The rails made this moral distancing easy. Once the train left your jurisdiction, it was no longer your problem. By the time the trains approached their final destinations, the passengers were barely recognizable as the people who had boarded days earlier. Hair matted, eyes sunken, bodies bruised and swollen, clothing stiff with filth. They had been reduced to survival itself. And yet, even then, the scale of what awaited them remained unimaginable. No matter how far they had traveled, no matter how much they had endured, the true purpose of the journey still lay ahead, concealed behind fences and smoke. The train slowed as they neared their endpoints. Wheels screeched. Steam hissed. The rhythm that had dominated days and nights faltered. People stirred, confused, afraid. Some straightened clothes. Some wiped faces with trembling hands. Some whispered prayers. Some prepared for work, for registration, for whatever came next. Across Europe, the rails had done their work. They had gathered people from dozens of countries, cultures, and communities. They had delivered them intact enough to be processed, broken enough to be controlled. They had transformed a continent into a single killing corridor. As this chapter closes, the trains converge on a handful of places whose names will soon become synonymous with horror. The journey across Europe is ending. Ahead lies the platform, the selection, the moment when the rails deliver their human cargo into the heart of the extermination system, where movement stops and something far worse begins. Chapter 8. The Role of Collaboration. The trains did not move through Europe by force alone. They moved because doors were opened, signals were switched, papers were stamped, hands extended, not always eagerly, but often willingly enough. The rails crossed borders that armies had conquered, but they also crossed borders that governments allowed to remain open. Collaboration was not always loud. Often, it sounded like silence. No single nation carried out the deportations by itself. The Holocaust on rails required cooperation at every stage. Local police who compiled lists, municipal officials who issued orders, railway workers who coupled cars and cleared tracks, border guards who waved trains through. Each action small, each decision framed as duty. Together, they formed the connective tissue that allowed genocide to function across an entire continent. In some places, collaboration was overt. Authorities aligned themselves ideologically with the occupiers, embracing anti-Semitic policies as their own. In others, it was cautious, transactional, or reluctant. But the effect was the same. Trains arrived on time. Deportees were delivered. The system held. The process often began at the local level. Neighborhood officials knew who lived where. They knew which apartments were Jewish, which families had already fled, which elders could not move quickly. This knowledge, gathered over years of civic administration, became a weapon. Lists were drawn up with unsettling accuracy. Names spelled correctly. Addresses confirmed. Errors corrected. Police forces played a central role. In many countries, it was local police who carried out arrests, not German soldiers. They knocked on doors in familiar uniforms, speaking familiar languages. This familiarity disarmed resistance. People complied because the authority looked normal, trusted, domestic. Once gathered, deportees were marched through streets they had walked their entire lives. Neighbors watched from windows, from doorways, from behind curtains. Some turned away. Some stared. A few whispered apologies. Most said nothing. The trains waited. Railway cooperation was indispensable. Local rail companies provided rolling stock. Engineers drove locomotives they had driven for years. Station masters cleared platforms. Schedules were adjusted to accommodate transports. Deportation trains were integrated seamlessly into existing networks, treated as just another service. Paperwork flowed between administrations. Requests were made. Permissions granted. Invoices issued. Payments processed. Each transaction reinforced the legitimacy of the operation. This was not chaos. It was governance. In France, the deportations relied heavily on French police and railway workers. Trains departed from Paris, carrying families arrested by their own countrymen. In the Netherlands, meticulous civil records made identification swift and devastatingly complete. In Slovakia and Croatia, local regimes implemented deportations with enthusiasm, eager to prove loyalty. In Hungary, collaboration reached a scale and speed that stunned even the Nazis. Within weeks, hundreds of thousands were rounded up, transported, and murdered. Local authorities organized ghettos, compiled lists, coordinated trains. The machinery worked because it was familiar, because it was domestic. Even in countries where resistance movements existed, collaboration often outpaced opposition. Sabotage occurred, but it was sporadic and dangerous. The trains were protected, repaired, rerouted. One damaged bridge slowed a transport. 10 others carried on. The psychological comfort of collaboration lay in delegation. Each participant could tell themselves that responsibility lay elsewhere. The police said they were following orders from above. The railway workers said they were obeying schedules. The politicians said they were preserving stability. Everyone pointed upward or outward. No one claimed ownership of the outcome. Language smoothed the process. Deportation was framed as policy. cooperation as obligation, refusal as treason. The moral calculus was buried beneath legalism. When something is legal, it feels permissible. When it is routine, it feels inevitable. There were moments when individuals hesitated, when a policeman recognized a face, when a clerk paused over a familiar name, when a railway worker heard sounds from inside a boxcar and understood they were not animals. These moments existed. They were real, but they were fleeting. The system did not reward hesitation. Refusal carried consequences: loss of employment, arrest, reprisal. In some places, execution. The risk was real, and yet, many complied not because of fear alone, but because compliance was easier. Because saying yes required less courage than saying no. The trains benefited from this human tendency toward inertia. Once the process began, stopping it felt impossible. It was always easier to let the train run than to derail it. In occupied territories, collaboration sometimes wore the mask of pragmatism. Officials told themselves they were mitigating harm, that by cooperating, they could reduce brutality. That refusal would only bring harsher measures. These rationalizations allowed the system to advance without open revolt. Railway unions rarely protested deportations. Transportation was framed as a neutral service. Cargo was cargo. The destination was not the driver's concern. This professional detachment was a powerful shield against guilt. Borders became formalities. Trains rolled from one jurisdiction into another with paperwork exchanged at stations. Guard changed. Crews rotated. The deportees remained locked inside. No single authority controlled the entire journey, and that fragmentation made accountability vanish. The collaboration extended beyond state institutions. Civilians informed on neighbors. Landlords reported tenants. Employers provided records. Each tip, each confirmation, each signed document fed the system. The trains required information as much as they required steel. In some regions, collaboration was motivated by opportunism. Vacated apartments were claimed. Businesses were seized. Property changed hands. The disappearance of one group meant opportunity for another. The trains carried away people, but they left behind possessions that tempted those who remained. The moral corrosion was gradual. It spread through societies like a slow infection. What began as compliance became participation. What began as indifference became complicity. There were exceptions. Individuals who warned, who hid, who sabotaged, who refused. These acts mattered. They saved lives. But they were isolated, overwhelmed by the scale of cooperation that surrounded them. For every act of resistance, thousands of acts of compliance kept the trains moving. The system did not require everyone to collaborate. It required only enough people at enough points. And it found them. As deportations intensified, collaboration became more institutionalized. Procedures were refined. Coordination improved. Meetings were held to resolve bottlenecks. The Holocaust became a shared administrative project, even among those who never fully acknowledged it as such. The victims sensed this betrayal acutely. They were not only being hunted by an occupying force, they were being handed over by their own societies. The realization cut deeply, adding psychological devastation to physical suffering. On the trains, people spoke in hushed tones about who had arrested them, about which uniforms they had seen, about which officials had signed orders. These details mattered because they shattered the illusion that this was solely a foreign crime. The rails crossed landscapes of collaboration. As the war progressed, collaboration persisted even as defeat loomed. Trains ran while cities burned. Deportations continued while armies retreated. The commitment to extermination outlasted military logic. It had become an end in itself. Some collaborators attempted to erase their tracks as the tide turned. Documents were destroyed. Orders denied. Responsibility deflected. But the rails remembered. Survivors remembered. The system left scars that could not be papered over. After the war, many claimed ignorance. They said they did not know where the trains were going, that they believed the lies, that they were only doing their jobs. These defenses echoed the same logic that had enabled collaboration in the first place. The truth was more uncomfortable. Many didn't know. Many suspected. Many chose not to look too closely. The trains provided distance, and distance provided deniability. Collaboration was not uniform. It varied by place, by time, by individual. But its cumulative effect was devastating. Without it, the Holocaust on rails would have slowed, fractured, perhaps even stalled. With it, genocide moved at the speed of modern transportation. The trains were never just German. They were European. They ran on tracks laid by many hands, maintained by many governments, cleared by many officials. The Holocaust was transported not through a vacuum, but through a web of cooperation that spanned continent. As this chapter closes, the picture is clear and unsettling. The rails did not impose themselves by force alone. They were welcomed, accommodated, facilitated. The trains moved because societies allowed them to move. And in allowing them, they became part of the machinery that carried millions toward annihilation. In the next chapter, the journey will end at the platforms where collaboration gives way to immediacy, where the doors open, the guards shout, and the full reality of what the trains have delivered can no longer be denied. Chapter 9: Arrival Platforms and Instant Selection. The train slowed with a long, metallic scream, wheels shrieking against the rails as if protesting the place they had reached. After days of darkness and motion, the sudden change disoriented those still standing inside the cars. Bodies swayed. Someone fell. Another did not rise. Outside, voices barked in a language that carried authority and threat in equal measure. Dogs snarled. Floodlights flared to life, slicing through the night. The doors were about to open. When the bolts slid back, the rush of air felt violent, almost painful. People gasped as if drowning victims pulled from water. Light flooded in, blinding after so many hours sealed inside. The smell hit next, sharp and unmistakable, even to those who had never smelled it before. Smoke. Burning. Something organic, sweet and foul at the same time. Confusion spread instantly. This was not a station like the others. Guards climbed onto the cars, shouting orders that overlapped and contradicted one another. Get out. Faster. Leave everything. Jump. Those too weak to jump were dragged. Those who hesitated were struck. The dead were pulled aside and tossed onto the gravel like broken luggage. The living stumbled forward, legs trembling, minds struggling to catch up with bodies that had already endured more than they believed possible. The platform was wide, flat, brutally illuminated. Barbed wire glinted beyond the tracks. Towers loomed, silhouettes against the night sky. The air vibrated with noise. Whistles. Shouting. Dogs. The low hum of machinery. Somewhere nearby, flames flickered behind walls. Ash drifted down like gray snow, settling on hair and shoulders. People brushed it away without understanding what it was. Families tried to stay together. Hands clutched hands with desperate force. Parents lifted children, whispered instructions, promised safety they could not guarantee. The instinct to protect flared, even as strength failed. The journey had stripped people down to reflexes, and this was the strongest one left. Then the line formed. Men in uniforms stood along the platform, watching the flow of bodies with practiced detachment. A gesture of the hand. Left, right, left, right. The movements were quick, almost casual. There was no deliberation, no conversation. The decision took seconds, sometimes less. A glance at a face, a look at hands, a judgment of posture, of age, of perceived usefulness. This was selection. Those directed one way were told they would work. Those sent the other way were told nothing at all, or sometimes reassured, sometimes ignored. The language shifted depending on the audience. Calm words for the anxious, shouts for the confused, violence for the slow. The terror lay not only in what was happening, but in how quickly it happened. After days of movement and waiting, fate was decided in a moment. There was no appeal, no explanation, no time to understand. The human mind could not process such speed. People obeyed because there was no alternative. Children were torn from parents' arms. Mothers screamed. Fathers lunged forward and were beaten back. Elderly couples who had survived decades together were split apart by a flick of a wrist. The platform filled with cries that rose and fell like waves, swallowed by the noise of the camp. Those selected for work were herded into lines, still shaking, still clutching whatever remained of their dignity. They believed, or tried to believe, that survival was possible. The lie of labor had carried them this far. It continued to carry them now. Those selected for death were guided elsewhere, often calmly, sometimes kindly. They were told they would bathe, that they would rest, that families would reunite soon. These lies were not improvised. They were rehearsed, refined, delivered with convincing authority. Panic was inefficient. Compliance was essential. The platform emptied with terrifying speed. Trains that had taken days to assemble were unloaded in minutes. The efficiency was staggering. It was the culmination of everything that had come before. Railways, bureaucracy, collaboration, all converged here, in this space where life was measured in seconds. For those watching from the lines, the separation was incomprehensible. They could still see loved ones walking away, still hear voices calling out, still believe that a mistake had been made. The finality had not yet registered. The human mind resists such conclusions. The guards did not linger. Another transport was already arriving. The machinery did not pause to allow grief. The schedule dictated the pace. Selection was not an event. It was a process repeated again and again, night after night, until it lost all novelty for those enforcing it. The sensory overload was overwhelming. Bright lights after darkness. Noise after suffocating silence. Space after compression. The sudden freedom of movement made some dizzy. People staggered, vomited, collapsed. Guards kicked them back to their feet. The smell grew stronger as people moved away from the platform. It clung to the air, impossible to ignore. Some asked what it was. Others did not want to know. Answers, when given, were vague or mocking. Truth was never offered willingly. The ground itself seemed hostile. Gravel cut bare feet. Cold bit through thin clothing. The air carried heat from fires and chill from night, confusing already exhausted bodies. Every sense screamed danger, yet there was no clear target for fear. Those selected for work were marched toward barracks. Along the way, they passed piles of belongings left behind on the platform. Suitcases, shoes, coats, toys, photographs spilled from broken cases. The sight was bewildering. Why would all this be abandoned? Where had the owners gone? Some recognized objects. A scarf, a bag, a familiar coat. Recognition struck like a blow. Understanding began to form, slow and horrifying. The platform itself was washed down between transports. Blood diluted with water ran along grooves in the concrete, disappearing into drains. By morning, little evidence remained. The rails shone. The space looked ready for the next arrival. For those who survived selection, the memory of that moment burned into consciousness. It replayed endlessly. The gesture of the hand, the last glimpse of a face, the sound of a name shouted into the night. Survivors would spend years wondering whether a different step, a different posture, a different second might have changed the outcome. But selection was not about fairness or justice. It was about efficiency. Bodies were assessed like tools. Those deemed useful were kept alive temporarily. The rest were discarded immediately. The process required no hatred, only adherence to criteria. The guards enforcing selection were not improvising. They had been trained. They knew how many workers were needed. They knew how many could be killed that night. The trains dictated the numbers. The system dictated the rest. Some transports arrived during the day. The sunlight made the scene even more surreal. Blue sky above, birds overhead, smoke rising steadily in the distance. Life and death occupying the same frame. The arrival platform was the point where abstraction ended. The trains had carried people across Europe as cargo. Here, that cargo was unpacked, sorted, and assigned a fate. The distance that had protected bureaucrats and railway officials vanished. This was the place where consequences became visible. And yet, even here, responsibility was fragmented. One man gave orders. Another enforced them. Another recorded numbers. Another supervised unloading. No single person claimed the whole act. The machinery absorbed blame as efficiently as it absorbed human beings. For those sent toward death, the path away from the platform was lined with deception. Signs pointed toward showers. Guards reassured the frightened. Families were told to remember where they left their belongings so they could retrieve them later. The lies were almost gentle, designed to calm rather than terrorize. The cruelty of this calm was profound. Children asked questions. Parents answered with half-truths, desperate to keep fear at bay. Some sensed the truth anyway. Children often do. They clung harder. They cried louder. They were carried forward regardless. Behind the scenes, the system continued to operate. Trains departed empty. Locomotives took on water and coal. Crews changed shifts. Paperwork was completed. Another transport was scheduled. The arrival platform existed in a state of perpetual motion. Even at rest, it was preparing for the next load. The Holocaust on rails did not allow pauses for reflection. Reflection threatened efficiency. Those who survived the platform would later struggle to describe it. Words failed. Metaphors fell short. How do you explain a place where your life was spared by accident while others were erased by design? How do you convey the weight of a hand gesture that determined existence? The arrival platform was not the end for survivors, but it was the end of the world they had known. It marked the moment when hope fractured irreparably. Even those chosen for work understood, at some level, that survival was temporary, conditional, revocable at any moment. For the dead, the platform was the last place they stood as living human beings. They arrived as people and left as smoke. The trains had done exactly what they were built to do. They delivered human beings with ruthless efficiency to a system designed to annihilate them. The rails ended here, but the process they fed continued beyond sight. As this chapter closes, the platform falls quiet again. Another transport has been processed. The lights remain on. Smoke continues to rise. And somewhere down the line, another train is already approaching, its doors sealed, its cargo unaware that their journey across Europe is about to end in a matter of seconds. Chapter 10: Showers, Smoke, and the Final Deception. They were told to remember the number above the hook, to keep their shoes together, to fold their clothes neatly. The instructions were delivered calmly, almost gently, as if this were an ordinary public bath, a pause after a long journey. After days inside sealed cars, the promise of water sounded like mercy. The word shower cut through fear and exhaustion, offering something familiar in a place that felt utterly alien. People clung to that word because it was the last ordinary thing they were allowed to believe. The path away from the platform narrowed, funneling bodies forward between fences and walls. Guards stood along the route, their posture relaxed, their voices firm but not panicked. Panic slowed the process. Calm accelerated it. The system depended on that difference. Mothers adjusted children's coats. Old men leaned on canes. People murmured reassurances they did not feel. The smell of smoke grew stronger with every step. The buildings they entered were solid, utilitarian, stripped of ornament. Concrete floors cold under bare feet. Walls damp to the touch. Hooks lined the walls in rows, each stamped with a number. The air echoed with footsteps and whispered questions. The architecture was deliberate. It was meant to look functional, temporary, reversible. Nothing about it suggested finality. People undressed quickly, urged on by guards who insisted there was no time to waste. Clothes were piled carefully, shoes placed side by side. Documents were tucked into pockets, wedding rings slipped into shoes for safekeeping. Parents memorized hook numbers and repeated them aloud, anchoring themselves to a future that no longer existed. Children asked where the water was. Parents answered soon, very soon. Some sensed the wrongness in the air, the way guards avoided eye contact, the way exits were one way. But exhaustion dulled instincts. After the trains, after the platform, resistance felt impossible. Bodies obeyed because they had learned that obedience was the only way to survive the moment. The doors closed behind them with sound that was not loud, but heavy, a finality disguised as routine. Inside, The room filled wall to wall with naked bodies, pressed close again, but without the darkness of the boxcar. Light revealed fear etched into faces, ribs protruding, bruises blooming across skin. The smell of sweat and terror replaced the stench of the train. The ceiling was studded with fixtures that resembled shower heads. People looked up and nodded to themselves. This made sense. This matched the story. Somewhere in the crowd, someone laughed nervously. Another prayed. Another stood very still, conserving breath. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. The silence stretched. Anxiety thickened the air. Someone knocked on the door. A voice called out, asking when the water would come. The reply, if there was one, was muffled, distant. Then came a sound that did not belong in a bathhouse. A metallic clank. A hiss. The gas did not arrive as a visible cloud. It seeped in, invisible, odorless at first, then burning, choking. Confusion erupted instantly. People coughed, clawed at throats, stumbled over one another. The room transformed in seconds from tense, waiting to chaos. Screams filled the space, ricocheting off concrete, drowning out reason. Parents lifted children high, desperate to keep them above the rising panic, above the invisible poison. Bodies pressed harder as instinct drove people toward doors that would not open. Nails scraped against metal. Fists pounded. The sound was animal, raw, stripped of language. Breath became agony. Lungs burned. Vision blurred. People collapsed, dragging others down with them. Those who fell were trampled by those still standing, not out of cruelty, but out of blind terror. Survival instincts turned inward, feral and unthinking. The room became a tangle of limbs and bodies, twisting, writhing, then slowing. The gas did not kill instantly. It suffocated gradually, forcing lungs to fight for air that would never come. The strongest lasted longest. The weakest fell first. Children went silent early. The noise faded in stages. Screams gave way to choking, choking to gasps, gasps to silence. The room settled into a stillness broken only by the hiss of the system completing its task. Outside, guards waited, checking watches, timing the process with professional detachment. When the doors were open again, the air rushed out carrying heat, stench, and death. Bodies lay piled where they had fallen, faces contorted, mouths open, eyes wide. Some were standing, held upright by the press of others, frozen in their final moments. The sight was not one of rage or hatred. It was industrial aftermath. Work resumed immediately. Prisoners assigned to this task entered wearing masks. Their job was to untangle bodies, to search mouth for gold teeth, to cut hair, to prepare corpses for disposal. They worked quickly because speed was demanded, and because delay meant confronting what they were doing for longer than necessary. The dead were dragged across floors slick with condensation and bodily fluids. The weight of bodies varied. Children were light, adults heavy and awkward, old people brittle. The smell clung to skin and clothing, impossible to wash away completely. It lodged in memory, resurfacing in nightmares long after the work ended. Outside, the machinery waited. Crematoria hummed. Fires burned. The dead were fed into ovens designed for volume, not dignity. Smoke rose steadily, a constant presence over the camp, visible for miles. Ash settled on nearby fields, on roofs, on skin. The dead returned to the world as residue. The process did not pause to acknowledge what had occurred. Another group was already being prepared. Another transport was unloading. The rhythm was relentless. Arrival, selection, deception, death, disposal. Repeat. The deception was essential. Panic disrupted efficiency. The lie of showers reduced resistance, preserved order, maximized throughput. It was refined through trial and error, adjusted to maintain calm as long as possible. The cruelty lay not only in the act itself, but in the calculated kindness that preceded it. Those who enforced the process rarely saw the entirety of it. Some handled intake. Others guarded corridors. Others operated machinery. Each role was bounded, limited, manageable. The system protected its operators from seeing themselves as murderers. They were technicians, supervisors, guards. The victims, however, experienced the full arc, compressed into hours. The journey, the platform, the separation, the lie, the final room. There was no space to process, to resist, to understand. The speed was part of the violence. For survivors who were spared this fate temporarily, the knowledge arrived slowly, then all at once. The smoke, the ash, the absence, the realization that those who had walked away calmly were gone forever. Understanding brought its own kind of terror, a weight that settled into the chest and never left. The camps were designed so that truth was revealed only after it was too late. New arrivals did not see the end of the line until they were already on it. Those who did see it were silenced. The system fed on ignorance, fear, and hope in equal measure. The gas chambers were not accidents of war. They were engineered spaces, integrated into the rail-fed system, calibrated for capacity and speed. They represented the final convergence of bureaucracy, technology, and ideology. The trains delivered. The chambers erased. Outside the camps, life continued. Trains ran. Markets opened. Children went to school. The smoke was explained away as industrial byproduct. The noise as machinery. Distance did the rest. Inside, the work never stopped. The night shift replaced the day shift. Maintenance crews cleaned and repaired. Ash was dumped into rivers, fields, pits. The landscape absorbed what it could. The rest lingered. The deception extended beyond the walls. Documents recorded numbers, not names. Causes of death were falsified. Destinations were coded. The system sought not only to kill, but to obscure killing behind procedure. And yet, the evidence was everywhere. In the smoke that never ceased. In the ash that coated everything. In the trains that arrived full and left empty. In the silence of those who never returned. The gas chambers marked the point where the Holocaust shed all pretense of relocation or labor. This was the core of the machine, the place where the journey ended not in confinement, but in annihilation. The trains had delivered their cargo exactly as intended. As this chapter closes, the deception has reached its most lethal form. Showers that are not showers. Baths that are tombs. Smoke that carries the weight of entire communities. And beyond the camp gates, the rails stretch back across Europe, already carrying the next transport, already feeding the system that has turned movement into murder and arrival into extinction. Some prisoners were assigned to sort belongings left behind on platforms. Mountains of shoes, glasses, suitcases, children's toys, wedding rings, photographs, letters never delivered. Each object carried a story that ended abruptly. Sorting became an exercise in grief suppression. Touching these remnants was like touching ghosts. The sheer volume defied comprehension. Entire communities reduced to piles of possessions in days. The trains made this accumulation possible. Without the rails, the camps would have choked on their own throughput. With them, the system flowed. The psychological toll of forced labor was immense. People lived with the knowledge that survival depended on compliance with a system designed to kill. They worked to stay alive while watching others die. They learned to measure days not by hope, but by endurance. Can I make it tomorrow? Can I avoid the next election? Can I keep moving? Selections did not end with arrival. They recurred constantly. Periodic inspections culled the weak, the sick, the injured. A cough, a limp, a moment of dizziness could be fatal. The trains delivered new bodies, and the system shed old ones with ruthless efficiency. Punishments were public. Beatings administered in front of lines. Executions carried out to remind everyone of consequences. Fear was as integral to productivity as hunger. The camps ran on terror as much as they ran on labor. Despite everything, sparks of humanity persisted. Prisoners shared crumbs, whispered warnings, held hands in the dark. These acts were small, fragile, and dangerous. But they mattered. They reminded people they were still human, even as the system tried to erase that fact. The labor tied prisoners to the rhythms of the trains. They learned schedules without being told. They sensed arrivals in the air, in the vibration of rails, in the sudden tightening of guards' movements. The trains dictated tempo. Work intensified with arrivals, eased briefly when tracks fell silent. Winter magnified suffering. Frostbitten fingers struggled to grip tools. Breath froze. Thin clothing offered no protection. Those who slowed were beaten to keep moving. Summer brought its own horrors. Heat, stench, swarms of insects, dehydration. The cycle never broke. The system demanded constant adaptation. When fuel ran low, alternatives were found. When crematoria failed, open-air pits were used. When disease threatened to spread beyond containment, victims were killed faster. The solution was always escalation. The trains did not just deliver people. They delivered raw material for a system that consumed bodies, labor, and hope. The camps were factories of death, but also factories of suffering that extracted every possible ounce of utility before disposal. Some prisoners were forced to handle the remains of those they recognized. A neighbor, a relative, a friend from the same town. Recognition struck like a physical blow. Survival demanded suppressing it. Many broke under that weight. Some deliberately sought death rather than continue. Others clung to life out of defiance, a refusal to grant the system total victory. Guards rotated shifts. They went home. They ate meals. They slept. The prisoners remained. This contrast deepened the sense of unreality. The world beyond the wire felt like a myth, something remembered from another lifetime. The camps were surrounded by communities that saw smoke and smelled burning flesh. Some pretended not to know. Some did know and said nothing. The trains made it easier to look away. They moved horror out of sight, delivered it behind fences, and returned empty. The forced labor extended beyond camp boundaries. Prisoners were marched to nearby factories, mines, farms. Civilians saw them daily. Emaciated figures in striped rags, guarded by men with guns. Normalcy and atrocity coexisted in plain view. As the war dragged on, the demand for labor increased, even as extermination continued. The system tried to have it both ways. Kill millions and exploit survivors. Trains adjusted accordingly, delivering workers and victims in proportions dictated by need. This tension revealed the core logic of the system. Human life had value only insofar as it could be extracted. Once depleted, it was discarded. The trains made this calculus possible on a continental scale. Inside the camps, rumors spread about liberation, about advancing armies, about an end. Hope flickered, dangerous but irresistible. Some clung to it. Others rejected it to avoid disappointment. The work continued regardless. The ash piles grew. Disposal became more urgent. Rivers carried gray residue downstream. Fields were fertilized with human remains. The landscape absorbed the crime, becoming complicit in its silence. The labor was not incidental. It was central. It allowed the camps to function continuously. It maximized efficiency. It turned victims into unwilling participants in their own destruction. This was perhaps the deepest cruelty of all. And yet, within this machinery, acts of sabotage occurred. A slowed step, a miscount, a tool dropped, a moment's delay. These acts were tiny, risky, often futile, but they represented resistance in a place where resistance was almost impossible. The trains kept arriving. The work kept going. Days blurred into weeks. Weeks into months. The system showed no signs of exhaustion, only expansion. As this chapter closes, the picture is one of relentless motion. The arrival platform feeds the camps. The camps feed the ovens. The ovens feed the ash pits. The ash drifts back into the world. And through it all, the trains continue to run, delivering new bodies into a machine that demands labor even as it promises death, ensuring that the Holocaust does not merely kill, but consumes every last ounce of life before it does. Chapter 11. After the arrival, forced labor, ash, and the machinery that never slept. Morning came without light. It arrived as sound first, the grinding cough of engines, the clang of metal doors, the barked orders cutting through fog and smoke. For those who had survived selection, Sleep ended abruptly, torn away before it could settle into bones already hollowed by hunger and fear. The night's transports had been processed. The platforms were quiet again, but the work had only begun. Survival did not mean safety. It meant assignment. Men and women were driven from barracks in a yard slick with frost or mud, lined up beneath watchtowers where rifles tracked every movement. Heads were shaved, numbers tattooed or recorded. Names were stripped away and replaced with identifiers meant to last only as long as usefulness did. Clothing was exchanged for rags that did little to protect against heat or cold. Shoes, when provided, rarely fit. Laces snapped. Soles split. Feet bled. The smell never left. Smoke drifted constantly, sweet and foul, settling into hair, into skin, into lungs. Ash clung to everything. It coated the ground, dusted the roofs, floated in the air like snow that never melted. New arrivals noticed it immediately. Veterans stopped noticing altogether. The human mind adapts, even to the unbearable. Work details were assigned with the same casual efficiency as selection. A gesture, a word, a push. Some were sent to construction, hauling stone and timber for endless expansions. Some to kitchens, scraping pots that would never be full. Some to factories inside or near the camps, producing weapons and parts for a war that consumed lives faster than it could end. And some were sent to the places no one volunteered for, but everyone feared. The labor connected directly to the trains. Everything did. Those assigned to unloading transports learned the rhythm of arrival. The screech of brakes, the hiss of steam, the doors bursting open, the surge of bodies spilling out. They saw faces fresh with terror, eyes still searching for explanations. They did not speak to them. They were not allowed to. Words were dangerous. Words lingered. Others were assigned to the aftermath of death. The work no one wanted, but the system required. Bodies had to be moved, sorted, stripped, burned. Ash had to be shoveled, sifted, disposed of. Teeth pried open, hair cut, gold collected. Even in death, nothing was allowed to go to waste. This work was carried out by prisoners under constant threat. Refusal meant immediate death. Slowing meant beating. Mistakes meant punishment. The cruelty lay not only in the labor itself, but in the knowledge that doing it prolonged one's own life at the cost of handling the dead of others. Moral injury layered atop physical exhaustion, crushing spirits in ways no hunger ever could. The camps never slept. If transports arrived at night, night shifts worked. If ovens overheated, maintenance crews were summoned. If ash piled too high, disposal teams were expanded. The system adjusted to volume with the same cold logic that had governed the railways. Capacity increased. Processes refined. Bottlenecks eliminated. The victims' labor sustained the very machinery that destroyed them. Food rations were calculated to keep bodies alive just long enough to work. Not enough to heal. Not enough to grow strong. Just enough to move. Bread weighed carefully. Soup diluted. Calories measured like fuel. When someone collapsed, another stepped into their place. There was always another body. Those who worked near the killing sites learned quickly not to look too closely. Looking invited madness. Some developed rituals to survive. Counting steps. Repeating phrases. Focusing on small tasks. Others shut down entirely, moving through days like shadows, waiting for an end that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The trains continued to arrive, feeding this cycle. Each transport meant more labor, more ash, more expansion. The camps grew outward, devouring forests, fields, villages. Tracks were extended deeper into perimeters. Platforms lengthened. Barracks multiplied. What had begun as improvised sites became industrial complexes. The soundscape was relentless. Whistles, engines, shouting, machinery, the crack of gunfire, the low roar of flames. Silence existed only in brief, uneasy pockets before the next command shattered it. Even death was noisy here, processed by machines that demanded constant attention. Chapter 12. When the trains began to stutter. The first sign was not mercy. It was delay. A whistle that did not blow on time. An engine that idled too long on a siding. A transport scheduled for dawn that did not arrive until night. Inside the camps, people noticed these things before anyone said them aloud. The trains had taught them how to listen, and now the rhythm was faltering. War had always hovered around the camps like distant thunder, heard but not yet felt. Now it drew closer. The air carried a different tension, sharper, more urgent. Guards moved faster. Voices rose. Orders contradicted one another. The machinery that had run with terrifying smoothness began to grind, not to a halt, but to something uneven and unpredictable. The railways were under strain. Bombing raids tore at junctions and bridges. Tracks buckled under repeated use and inadequate repair. Coal grew scarce. Locomotives broke down more often. Skilled crews were drafted or killed. The network that had once prided itself on perfect timing now scrambled to improvise. For years, deportation trains had enjoyed priority. They ran even when civilian services were cut, even when food shipments stalled. Now they competed with retreating armies, wounded soldiers, fleeing administrators, and desperate civilians. The rails could no longer serve every demand at once. Inside boxcars, delays became deadly in new ways. Trains sat motionless for hours or days, trapped on sidings while bombs fell nearby. Heat built. Cold seeped in. People who might have survived a shorter journey died, waiting for tracks to clear. The system had never been designed for mercy, only for speed. When speed vanished, suffering multiplied. In the camps, the impact was immediate. Fewer arrivals meant temporary lulls in killing, but not in death. Food rations were cut again as supplies faltered. Forced labor intensified to compensate for shortages. Those too weak to work were selected out more frequently. Survival became even more fragile. The guards felt the change too. Their confidence wavered. Some grew harsher, determined to maintain control through violence. Others became distracted, anxious, checking the sky, listening for distant artillery. Discipline cracked at the edges. Fear seeped downward through the ranks. Rumors spread among prisoners like sparks. The front is close. The Germans are retreating. The trains are turning around. No one knew what to believe. Hope flared and burned out repeatedly, each time leaving deeper scars. The camps themselves began to shift purpose. With extermination facilities threatened by advancing armies, the system adapted once more. Prisoners were no longer merely killed on arrival. They were moved. Again, evacuation became the new euphemism. Camps closer to the front were emptied, their prisoners forced onto trains or marched on foot toward the interior. The irony was unbearable. The same rails that had delivered people to death now carried survivors away from it, not to freedom, but to further suffering. These evacuation transports were even more brutal than those that came before. Overcrowded cars filled with people already weakened by months or years of starvation and labor. Little food, little water, constant movement interrupted by sudden stops. The dead accumulated quickly, their bodies left behind on tracks or piled at stations. Winter magnified everything. Snow fell through broken roofs of boxcars. Wind cut through gaps in wood. People huddled together, sharing what little warmth remained. Those who slipped into sleep often did not wake. The trains crawled through frozen landscapes littered with the debris of a collapsing war. Outside, the world was unraveling. Cities burned. Refugees flooded roads. Military trains thundered past, packed with men and equipment moving in the opposite direction. The contrast was surreal. One system in retreat, another still trying to complete its work. The bureaucracy strained to keep up. Orders changed daily. Destinations shifted. Camps that had once processed thousands a day now struggled to function at all. Equipment broke down. Staff fled or were reassigned. Records grew sloppy. The perfect paper trail frayed. And yet, the commitment to destruction did not vanish. Even as defeat loomed, the regime attempted to erase evidence. Camps were dismantled. Gas chambers destroyed. Ash pits filled in. Documents burned. Trains carried not only prisoners, but secrets. Prisoners were forced to dig up mass graves, to burn bodies that had been buried months earlier, to scatter remains. This work was done under frantic pressure, as if time itself had become the enemy. Smoke rose in thicker columns, betraying the very crimes it was meant to conceal. The trains became instruments of concealment as much as murder. They removed witnesses. They redistributed survivors so that no one place held too many who could later speak. The system adapted, even in collapse. For those trapped inside it, the experience was one of constant disorientation. Just when patterns were learned, they changed. Just when despair settled into numbness, hope flickered again. The human psyche was stretched to breaking. Some transports were abandoned mid-journey as tracks were destroyed or routes cut off. Prisoners were unloaded in forests or fields and marched onward. Those who collapsed were shot. Others stumbled forward, driven by fear of the gun behind them. These death marches were extensions of the trains, their cruelty translated from steel to flesh. Movement remained the weapon. Exhaustion remained the goal. Survival remained accidental. Inside the camps, still operating, the absence of regular transports created eerie pauses. Platforms stood empty. Tracks rusted. Smoke thinned. For the first time, silence felt possible. It was terrifying. Liberation loomed, but it did not arrive evenly. Some camps were abandoned in haste, guards fleeing overnight. Prisoners woke to find gates open, towers empty, weapons discarded. Others remained trapped until the last possible moment, used as bargaining chips or shields. The trains, once symbols of unstoppable efficiency, now symbolized desperation. Engines were overloaded. Cars derailed. Schedules meant nothing. The rails themselves bore scars of bombardment and sabotage. For railway workers, the illusion of neutrality collapsed. They could no longer claim to be mere technicians when trains carried dying people through battle zones. Some abandoned their posts. Others continued, driven by fear or habit. The system no longer rewarded professionalism. It punished everyone. The victims sensed the shift most acutely. The certainty of death gave way to the uncertainty of survival. Both were terrifying. Those who had resigned themselves to dying now faced the possibility of living with what they had endured. That prospect was almost as overwhelming. As Allied forces advanced, they encountered the aftermath of stalled transports. Boxcars filled with corpses, sidings littered with bodies, survivors wandering in shock. The rails testified to crimes that could no longer be hidden. Inside the camps, those still alive watched guards destroy records, dismantle machinery, burn buildings. The evidence vanished before their eyes. The truth seemed to be evaporating along with smoke and ash. Yet the trains left traces that could not be erased. Track patterns, schedules, invoices, survivor memories. The system had been too vast, too documented, too reliant on infrastructure to disappear completely. For some prisoners, liberation came suddenly, violently. Tanks crashed through fences. Gunfire erupted. Orders were shouted in unfamiliar languages. Guards fled or surrendered. The smell of death lingered, but the machinery had stopped. For others, liberation came too late. Bodies lay where they had fallen during evacuations, along tracks, in ditches on roads. The trains had carried them as far as they could, then left them behind. The end was not clean. It was fragmented, chaotic, uneven. Just as the Holocaust on rails had unfolded differently across regions, its collapse varied from place to place. There was no single moment of cessation, only a gradual grinding down. Those who survived emerged into a world that struggled to comprehend what they described. The trains featured prominently in their memories. The darkness, the smell, the noise, the sealed doors, the endless movement, the way everything important happened while the world looked away. The rails themselves remained, stretching across Europe, ready to carry people once more. Commerce resumed. Passengers returned. Timetables were rewritten. The infrastructure endured, indifferent to what it had carried. For survivors, the sound of a train could trigger terror years later. The rhythm of wheels, the hiss of steam, the slam of doors. The memory lived on in the body long after the war ended. As this chapter closes, the Holocaust machinery is no longer running smoothly. The trains falter. The camp strain. The system that once prided itself on efficiency is collapsing under the weight of its own crimes and the pressure of a war it cannot win. But even in collapse, it continues to kill, to hide, to move human beings as objects until the very last moment. The rails have begun to stutter, but the damage they have done is already etched into the continent, into the landscape, and into the lives of those who will carry its echoes forever. Chapter 13. Liberation on the Rails and the Weight of Survival. The first soldiers who followed the tracks did not understand what they were seeing. Rails led them not to cities or factories, but to silence. Boxcars sat abandoned on sidings, doors yawning open, as if frozen mid-breath. Inside were bodies piled where movement had ended, some long dead, some barely alive, eyes tracking light with a confusion that bordered on disbelief. The trains had stopped, but the suffering had not. Liberation arrived, not as a clean break, but as an interruption to a crime that had already happened. The rails told the story before any witness could. They led through scorched junctions and shattered bridges to camps that still smoked, to platforms stained and washed and stained again. The air carried a smell that clung to uniforms and hair, a smell that would not leave. Soldiers moved cautiously, weapons raised out of habit, then lowered them as they realized there was no enemy here, only survivors too weak to stand and dead who could not be helped. Liberation was not a single moment. It unfolded unevenly along the lines of advance, one camp at a time, one train at a time, sometimes one car at a time. In some places, guards had fled days earlier, leaving prisoners locked inside barracks or boxcars with no food and no instructions. In others, the last transports arrived hours before tanks rolled in, their passengers delivered into a world already collapsing. Those who survived the trains to see liberation struggled to recognize it. After years of being deceived, kindness felt dangerous. Food offered by soldiers was refused by some, hoarded by others, consumed too quickly by bodies that could not handle it. Medical teams rushed in, overwhelmed by starvation, disease, and shock. The work of saving lives collided with the damage already done. Along the rails, scenes repeated themselves. Sightings filled with boxcars discovered too late. Survivors found lying among the dead, unable to speak, too weak to cry out. When doors were opened, the rush of air carried not relief, but the weight of what had happened inside. Soldiers stepped back, stunned. Some wept openly. Others grew silent, faces hardening as comprehension settled in. The trains that had once moved with precision now stood as evidence. Paperwork lay scattered in offices hastily abandoned. Schedules, invoices, manifests, records that mapped death with bureaucratic calm. Investigators followed these trails, realizing that the crime was not hidden in chaos, but preserved in order. For survivors, liberation brought a different burden. The sudden absence of commands and threats left a void. Days that had once been structured by fear now stretched open and uncertain. Many did not know where to go, or whether anyone was left to go to. The trains had carried them away from homes that no longer existed, into a future that felt just as unreal as the past. Some survivors followed the rails backward, hoping they might lead home. They boarded trains again, this time voluntarily, though every sound echoed with memory. Wheels clattered, doors slammed, steam hissed, bodies tensed. Even when the destination promised safety, the journey reopened wounds that had never closed. Others could not bring themselves to board another train. They walked instead, moving slowly through landscapes scarred by war, past towns that had watched trains pass without stopping. Faces stared back with curiosity, guilt, or indifference. Liberation did not erase the knowledge that the world had continued while they were being erased. The camps themselves became places of testimony. Survivors guided soldiers and journalists through barracks and yards, pointing to platforms and chimneys, to rooms stripped of equipment in desperate attempts to hide evidence. Words came haltingly. Gestures filled the gaps. The truth emerged in fragments, heavy and undeniable. On the rails, the aftermath was impossible to ignore. Bodies lay along routes used for evacuations, where trains had given way to forced marches. Some had died mid-journey, collapsing beside tracks that led nowhere now. Others had been shot where they fell. The rails traced not just transport, but retreat and desperation. The work of documenting the crime began almost immediately. Photographs were taken, testimonies recorded, maps drawn. Investigators traced the flow of trains across borders, through stations and junctions, reconstructing a system that had spanned a continent. The scale stunned even those who had fought the war. Railway workers were questioned. Some claimed ignorance. Others admitted knowledge they had tried to bury. Records contradicted excuses. Schedules showed priority given to deportation trains, even as cities starved. Invoices revealed costs calculated for human transport. The rails had been neutral only in myth. For survivors, the weight of survival pressed down harder with each passing day. Guilt took root alongside relief. Why had they lived when so many had died? The question haunted nights and followed them into daylight. The trains had delivered them to death's doorstep and, by chance or circumstance, turned away at the last moment. The physical toll lingered. Bodies weakened by starvation struggled to heal. Diseases took months to treat. Limbs bore scars from labor and violence. But the deepest wounds were invisible. Loud noises triggered panic. Enclosed spaces suffocated. The sound of a whistle could send hearts racing. As displaced persons' camps filled, survivors from different countries found one another, sharing stories that overlapped and diverged. Languages mixed. Memories aligned. The trains emerged again and again as the central thread. Everyone had a journey. Everyone had a boxcar. Everyone had a moment when the doors closed and the world narrowed to darkness. Some returned to their towns to find strangers living in their homes, neighbors who claimed not to recognize them. Records were gone, property seized, families annihilated. The trains had not just carried people away. They had emptied spaces others rushed to fill. Justice moved slowly. Trials gathered evidence, summoned witnesses, confronted perpetrators. The railways were scrutinized, their role dissected. Arguments were made about responsibility, about following orders, about technical necessity. Survivors listened as their suffering was debated in legal language that struggled to contain it. The rails themselves returned to service. Trains carried food, refugees, soldiers heading home. Timetables were restored. Stations repaired. Life resumed atop infrastructure soaked with memory. To many, this continuity felt like betrayal. To others, it was necessary. The world could not stop moving. Yet the rails could not be cleansed entirely. Memorials rose at stations where deportations had begun. Plaques marked platforms from which families had vanished. Survivors returned years later, standing in places where they had last seen loved ones, the sound of modern trains passing through the silence of memory. Liberation revealed not just what had been done, but how easily it had been done. The trains did not require secrecy or frenzy. They required cooperation, schedules, and silence. This realization unsettled societies that wanted to believe the Holocaust was an aberration, not a warning. For those who had lived through it, survival became a responsibility. To remember, to speak, to bear witness to journeys that ended in smoke and ash. Many struggled to tell their stories, fearing disbelief or indifference. Others spoke relentlessly, driven by the knowledge that silence had once been deadly. The rails became symbols in these testimonies, not as abstract lines on maps, but as lived experience. The jolt of movement, the loss of air, the cries in darkness, the sudden, blinding light of arrival. The trains condensed the Holocaust into a single, unforgettable trajectory. As years passed, survivors built lives amid the wreckage. Families formed. Children were born. The sound of trains became part of everyday life again, but never neutral. Each journey carried echoes of another, earlier one that had defined everything. Liberation did not erase the past. It exposed it. It forced a reckoning with systems and choices that had turned modern efficiency into a tool of annihilation. The rails stood at the center of that reckoning, tangible proof that genocide had moved not through chaos, but through infrastructure. As this chapter closes, the trains are running again across Europe, carrying passengers who check watches and destinations, unaware of the layers beneath their feet. But for those who survived, the rails will always carry another story, one written in darkness and sealed doors, in smoke and ash, in the weight of survival that followed liberation and never truly lifted. Chapter 14. The tracks remain: memory, denial, and the shadow of the rails. After the war, the trains did not stop. They simply changed passengers. Timetables were rewritten, stations repaired, platforms scrubbed clean. New posters went up where old ones had been torn down. The same rails that had carried millions toward death now carried commuters to work, children to school, families on holiday. Steel endured. Memory did not. In the months after liberation, Europe tried to move forward, but the rails pulled the past along with it. Survivors heard the sound of wheels at night and were transported backward in their minds, back into darkness and sealed doors. A whistle could still freeze blood. The slam of a carriage door could still steal breath. Even in peace, the body remembered what the world wanted to forget. Across the continent, railway administrations returned to routine operations with astonishing speed. Employees reclaimed uniforms. Offices reopened. Ledgers continued where they had left off, minus certain pages quietly removed. For many, this return to normalcy felt necessary. For others, it felt obscene. The same systems that had made genocide possible were now treated as neutral again, as if intention had never passed through them. Trials attempted to impose order on memory. Courtrooms filled with documents, testimonies, and schedules that mapped the Holocaust in lines and numbers. Prosecutors traced routes. Witnesses described journeys. Survivors spoke of boxcars and suffocation, of arrivals and selections, of journeys that erased entire families. Defendants responded with familiar language. I followed orders. I was only a technician. I did not know the destination. The rails stood at the center of these arguments. Could steel be guilty? Could schedules kill? Could efficiency be a crime? The answers were uncomfortable, because they challenged comforting myths about modern systems being inherently benign. The trains had not killed by accident. They had killed by design. Some railway officials were convicted. Many were not. Responsibility fragmented, just as it had during the war. No single hand had turned the wheel alone. The system had protected its participants by distributing guilt until it was nearly invisible. Justice struggled to grasp something so diffuse. In towns and cities across Europe, deportation sites became ordinary again. People stood on platforms where families had once been forced onto trains. Coffee kiosks opened. Announcements echoed. Luggage rolled past spots where screams had once risen into the air. Time layered itself over trauma, softening edges without erasing them. For survivors, returning to these places was often unbearable. Some avoided trains altogether, choosing longer routes on foot or by bus. Others forced themselves back onto platforms, determined not to let fear dictate the rest of their lives. Each choice carried its own cost. The rails also carried denial. As decades passed, voices emerged that questioned, minimized, or distorted what had happened. Numbers were debated. Intent was blurred. Responsibility diluted further. The distance created by time made forgetting tempting, especially for those who had benefited from silence. But the evidence refused to vanish. Survivors' testimonies accumulated. Documents resurfaced. Scholars reconstructed schedules and routes with forensic precision. Maps revealed how seamlessly the trains had connected ghettos to camps, cities to killing centers. The Holocaust on rails was not a metaphor. It was a logistical reality. Memorials began to appear at stations and along tracks. Plaques embedded in platforms. Sculptures shaped like suitcases or rails bent into impossible forms. Names carved into stone where names had once been erased. These memorials did not stop trains. They interrupted thought. They asked passengers to pause, if only for a moment, and consider what had once departed from this place. Education followed memory unevenly. In some countries, the role of railways and local collaboration was confronted directly. In others, it remained uncomfortable, softened, or omitted. National narratives preferred heroism to complicity. The trains complicated those stories because they crossed borders and implicated many. For younger generations, the Holocaust increasingly became history rather than memory. Textbooks replaced witnesses. Museums replaced voices. The challenge shifted from remembering to understanding. How could something so systematic have happened? How could ordinary institutions have been transformed into tools of annihilation? The rails offered an answer that was both simple and terrifying. Genocide did not require chaos. It required coordination. It required systems that valued efficiency over humanity. It required people willing to do their jobs without asking where the line ended. Survivors aged. Many carried the weight of their journeys into old age, still dreaming of trains, still waking with the sensation of bodies pressing in from all sides. As they passed away, urgency grew. Memory could not rely on living testimony forever. It had to be anchored in places, in records, in education. Some returned one last time to the tracks that had changed everything. They stood quietly, listening to modern trains rush past, faster and quieter than the ones they remembered. Progress layered over horror. Technology advanced. The rails remained. The question that lingered was not only what had happened, but what it meant. The trains demonstrated how modernity itself could be weaponized, how infrastructure built to connect could be used to destroy, how obedience and routine could coexist with unimaginable cruelty. In moments of crisis after the war, these lessons resurfaced. When populations were displaced, when trains again carried refugees, when bureaucracies reduced people to categories, history whispered warnings along the rails. And yet, denial persisted. Some insisted the trains were just tools. That responsibility lay elsewhere. That focusing on infrastructure distracted from ideology. But this was a false choice. The Holocaust required both hatred and logistics. Without one, the other could not have achieved such scale. The tracks remain because they're useful. They always were. The danger lies not in their existence, but in forgetting what they once carried. Forgetting makes repetition possible. Memory, however uncomfortable, is the only break history possesses. As this chapter closes, Europe moves forward on the same rails that once moved genocide. Passengers glance at phones. Children press faces to windows. Stations hum with life. Beneath this normalcy lies another map, invisible but indelible, tracing routes of disappearance and death. The trains no longer carry victims in sealed cars, but the shadow of the rails remains, stretching backward through time, reminding us that the Holocaust was not only an explosion of hatred, but a journey made possible by systems that worked exactly as designed. Chapter 15, the final lesson of the trains. The trains are still running. That is the most unsettling truth of all. Long after the smoke cleared, long after the camps were liberated and the documents cataloged, the rails remained exactly where they had always been. Steel does not feel guilt. Schedules do not remember screams. The same tracks that once carried people in darkness now carry them in daylight. And the world moves forward without stopping to listen for echoes beneath the wheels. But the echoes are there. They live in the rhythm of motion, in the way a carriage sways just enough to remind survivors of bodies pressed too close, of balance maintained only by the presence of others. They live in the sound of a door closing, the hollow finality of metal on metal. They live in the smell of oil and iron that can still, decades later, trigger a rush of panic without warning. The trains did not just transport victims. They imprinted themselves on memory. The Holocaust did not begin in the camps, and it did not end with liberation. It began when human beings were transformed into cargo, when movement replaced murder as the first step toward annihilation. The trains were not a footnote to genocide. They were its circulatory system, its enabling force, the means by which ideology was translated into action at a continental scale. This is the lesson the rails teach, and it is not confined to the past. What made the trains so lethal was not their brutality, but their normality. Trains were familiar, trusted, boring even. They represented progress, connection, modern life. That familiarity disarmed resistance. When people were put onto trains, it felt administrative rather than violent, temporary rather than final. The machinery of death hid inside the machinery of everyday life. That disguise is what allowed millions to be moved without mass revolt. It is what allowed neighbors to watch deportations and return to dinner. It is what allowed clerks to stamp forms, engineers to drive locomotives, station masters to clear platforms, all while telling themselves they were not involved in killing. The trains did not look like weapons, and that is precisely why they were so effective. Genocide, as the Holocaust revealed, does not always arrive wearing the face of chaos. Sometimes it arrives wearing a uniform of order, armed with timetables and regulations, supported by people who believe their responsibility ends at the edge of their job description. The trains taught the world that efficiency without ethics is not neutral. It is dangerous. For survivors, this understanding came at a terrible cost. They carried it into lives rebuilt from fragments, into families formed in the shadow of loss, into old age haunted by journeys that never truly ended. Many spoke not only of what was done to them, but of how it was done, because the how mattered as much as the what. The trains revealed how easily systems can be turned against the people they were meant to serve. For societies, the lesson was harder to accept. It required acknowledging that the Holocaust was not only the work of fanatics and monsters, but of institutions, professionals, and ordinary citizens who complied, cooperated, or looked away. The rails cut through comforting myths of innocence. They showed that modern states possess immense power to move, categorize, and erase human beings, and that this power can be misused with frightening speed. Memory is the only counterweight. That is why platforms are marked, why plaques are placed at stations, why names are read aloud where trains once departed in silence. These acts do not change the past. They interrupt the present. They force a pause in the flow of everyday life, a reminder that beneath convenience and efficiency lies responsibility. The trains also remind us that distance does not absolve. The people who scheduled transports did not see the gas chambers. The engineers who drove locomotives did not watch selections. The clerks who filed paperwork did not smell burning flesh. And yet, without each of them, the system would have failed. Distance was the mechanism by which conscience was dulled. It remains so today, whenever harm is outsourced, abstracted, or hidden behind process. The Holocaust on rails teaches that moral failure rarely announces itself as evil. It announces itself as routine, as necessity, as policy. It advances through small decisions made repeatedly, through habits that replace judgment, through silence mistaken for neutrality. The trains did not ask questions. The tragedy is that too many people chose not to either. This lesson is not limited to one time or place. Every society builds systems to manage people, to move them, to classify them. These systems can protect or destroy depending on how they are used and who is willing to challenge them. The rails warn us what happens when no one pulls the brake. For those who never returned, the trains were the last experience of movement, the final journey from which there was no arrival. Their lives ended not in anonymity, but in a system that recorded every step except the meaning of what it did. Remembering them requires more than mourning. It requires vigilance. For those who survived, the trains became symbols of both terror and testimony. They survived to tell not only of death, but of how death was made possible. Their stories demand that we look beyond individual hatred to the structures that enabled it, beyond ideology to infrastructure, beyond villains to systems. As time passes, the risk is not forgetting that the Holocaust happened, but forgetting how it happened. Forgetting that it moved on schedules. Forgetting that it required cooperation. Forgetting that it depended on people doing their jobs well and asking nothing more. The trains warn us against that forgetting. Today, as trains cross Europe and the world, carrying commuters and travelers, refugees and migrants, goods and dreams. The rails remain neutral only in appearance. They are tools, and tools reflect the values of those who wield them. The Holocaust proved that modern tools can be turned toward ancient hatreds with devastating efficiency. The final lesson of the trains is not about despair. It is about responsibility. Responsibility to question orders that dehumanize. Responsibility to recognize when systems begin to treat people as problems to be solved rather than lives to be protected. Responsibility to remember that progress without conscience can become its own kind of catastrophe. The trains are still running. That fact does not condemn us. What condemns us is forgetting what they once carried and what they made possible when no one stopped them. Memory is the brake. Vigilance is the guard at the switch. And the choice, always, belongs to those who hear the whistle and decide whether to let the train pass without asking where it is going.